The most photographed woman in the world is dying, and she has asked that no camera be brought in. That single fact is the whole story. Everything else is explanation. Osborne House, Isle of Wight, January 22nd, 1901. Outside. The winter light is flat and cold over the Solent. Inside a bedroom on the upper floor, the woman who had sat for more photographs than any monarch before her is spending her last hours in deliberate darkness, unseen for the first time in 60 years. Her name is Alexandrina Victoria. She has been Queen of the United Kingdom since 1837. She has been Empress of India since 1876. She is 81 years old, and she weighs barely 90 pounds. And the empire that covers 1/4 of the Earth's land surface is waiting outside the door of this one small room. 2 men are with her. One is her son, Edward, 59 years old, who has waited his entire adult life for the throne his mother has occupied since before he was born. He will be king before this day is over. He knows it. She knows it. They do not speak of it. The other man is her grandson, Wilhelm, the German Kaiser. He has taken a train and a boat to get here in time. He is holding his grandmother in his arms, and he will hold her for 2.5 hours without moving. And everyone in the room can see that the grief on his face is real. 13 years from this night, Wilhelm will help lead Germany into the war that breaks royal Europe apart forever. Millions will die. The family map Victoria spent her life building will become a war map, but that is 13 years away. Tonight, he is a grandson holding a dying woman. And the grief is real. And both things are true at the same time. Beyond this room, beyond this island, her family stretches across a continent. Nicholas in Russia, George in Britain, kings and queens and crown princes in Germany, in Spain, in Romania, in Greece, in Norway. She is the grandmother of Europe, and the map of her grandchildren is also the map of the war that is coming, and she does not know it. And perhaps that is a mercy. In the weeks before, she lost the strength to give clear instructions. She told her household what she wanted, placed with her when the time came. The dressing gown of her husband, Albert, dead 40 years. A cast of his hand, made in plaster the year he died. So she would have the shape of his fingers even when she could no longer remember the warmth of them. A lock of his hair, and, one more thing, a white dress from the morning of February 10th, 1840. She had not worn it since. 61 years. And at the end of all of it, she wanted that dress in the ground with her. Why? That question takes 63 years to answer. It begins not with a crown, not with an empire, not with a photograph. It begins with a staircase, and a little girl who was not allowed to walk down it alone. Every morning of her childhood, Victoria was not allowed to walk down the stairs by herself. This was not a rule anyone wrote down. It did not need to be written down. It was simply the way things were in Kensington Palace in the 1820s and 1830s. The same way the sun came up, and lessons happened at the same hour every day, and no one came to visit without being approved in advance. Victoria slept in her mother's bedroom until she was nearly a teenager. She never had an hour alone. She never had a friend her own age. When she walked anywhere in the palace, a hand was always on her arm. The system had a name, though not one its architects used in public. Historians would later call it the Kensington system. And The word system is exactly right, because this was not an overprotective mother making anxious choices. This was a program, carefully designed, with a specific political goal. The architect was a man named Sir John Conroy. Conroy was the comptroller of the household of Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent. He was charming, ambitious, and possessed of a quality that is always dangerous in men near power. He was very good at making himself indispensable. He had figured out, sometime in the early 1820s, that the little girl growing up in Kensington Palace was almost certain to become Queen of England. King George IV had no legitimate children. His brother William, who would become King William IV, had no legitimate children either. The line of succession ran straight to Victoria, the daughter of the Duke of Kent, who had died when she was less than a year old. Conroy understood what that meant before almost anyone else did. And he understood something else. If Victoria could be kept isolated, kept dependent, kept convinced that she could not function without her mother and the people her mother trusted, then, when she became queen, whoever controlled her mother would control the throne. It was, in its way, a brilliant plan. It was also a plan that required treating a child like a piece of property, and Conroy executed it without apparent discomfort. The rules of the Kensington system were total. Victoria was never to be left alone with any adult who had not been approved. She was never to meet strangers without supervision. She was not to form attachments outside the household. Her letters were read. Her diary, when she began keeping one at 13, was reviewed by her mother every day. She slept in her mother's room not because she was frightened, but because the arrangement made unsupervised conversation impossible. She had one companion of anything approaching her own age, a girl named Victoire Conroy, the daughter of Sir John himself. This was not an accident. What Victoria had instead of a childhood was structure, lessons in languages, music, drawing, history, and constitutional law, taught by tutors who reported to her mother, walks in the garden, supervised, carriage rides, supervised, public appearances at a careful distance, orchestrated to show the heir to the throne without letting anyone actually speak to her. She also had a journal. The journal is where Victoria becomes real to us, because she wrote in it with a directness that the Kensington system could supervise but could not fully suppress. She wrote about her lessons. She wrote about the operas she attended, which she adored. She wrote about the people she was not allowed to know. And she wrote, with a 13-year-old's imperfect concealment, about the thing that lived underneath every day of her childhood, like a stone beneath thin ice. She wanted out, not dramatically, not in the language of rebellion, but in the quiet, persistent language of a child who has learned that the world contains things she is not permitted to have, and who has decided to remember every single one of them until the day she is permitted to reach for them. She was not without weapons. She had, from a very early age, a quality that would later unsettle prime ministers and alarm foreign governments. She knew her own mind, not in the way that stubborn children know their minds, insisting on things simply because they have decided to insist. Victoria knew her mind the way a compass knows north. She could be pressured. She could be outmaneuvered. She could be exhausted into compliance on small things. But on the things that mattered to her, she did not move. Conroy found this out the hard way. In 1835, when Victoria was 16, she became seriously ill with typhoid fever. Conroy came to her sickbed and presented her with a document Sign this, he told her, and appoint me your private secretary when you become queen. You are weak. You need support. Sign now, while you have the chance to secure your future. Victoria, sick and bedridden, refused. She refused again when he pressed. She refused a third time. She did not sign. She would never sign. And in that sick-room refusal, against a man who had the support of her mother and the full weight of the system he had built around her, something became clear that Conroy had not fully accounted for in his calculations. The girl he had spent years trying to make dependent had spent those same years becoming something else entirely. She had been practicing, not with grand gestures, not with confrontations, she could not win, but in the margins of every controlled day, in the two-layered diary entries that said one thing for her mother and preserved something else for herself, in the quiet accumulation of observations about how power worked and who had it and what it cost to pretend you did not want it. Kensington had tried to make her small. It had made her careful, instead. There is a difference, and it matters enormously when we try to understand everything that comes after. On May 24th, 1837, Victoria turned 18. Under British law, she was now old enough to rule without a regent. The mechanism Conroy had spent a decade building, the mechanism that required her to be too young to rule alone, collapsed the moment the calendar turned. He had one chance left. William IV, her uncle the king, was dying. If he lived long enough, there might still be time to pressure Victoria into the agreements she had refused to sign. Conroy lobbied. The Duchess of Kent applied what pressure she could. Victoria sat in Kensington and waited. William IV died on June 20th, 1837, at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. Victoria learned the news at 6. They came before the city was awake. Lord Conyngham, the Lord Chamberlain, and the Archbishop of Canterbury arrived at Kensington Palace in the early hours of June 20th, 1837, and they had to wait, not because Victoria was unavailable, because no one in the palace would wake her without first waking her mother, and waking the Duchess of Kent took time, and time was the one thing that the death of a king does not pause for. When they finally reached her, Victoria came into the room alone. That detail matters. Every account of that morning notes it, because it was the first visible crack in the Kensington system, the first sign that something had shifted. She had been told the men were there. She had dressed, and she had walked into the room where they were waiting without her mother beside her, without Conroy behind her, without anyone holding her arm on the stairs. She was 18 years old, and she had not slept, and her uncle the king was dead, and she was, as of approximately 2 hours ago, the Queen of England. Conyngham told her. She received the news standing. She asked several questions about the arrangements that would need to be made. The Archbishop offered a prayer. Then she asked both men to wait, and she went to write in her journal, and what she wrote was this: since it had pleased Providence to place her in this position, she would do her utmost to fulfill her duty. Not triumph, not relief, though relief must have been there underneath everything. Duty. The word she reached for first was duty. Remember that, because it will define every hard thing she does in the 63 years that follow. Later that morning, she held her first Privy Council. The men who assembled in the Red Salon at Kensington that morning were among the most powerful in England, and most of them had never seen her before. She had been kept too far from the world for that. They came, expecting to find what the Kensington system had advertised: a sheltered girl, uncertain, in need of guidance. What they found made several of them write letters home that evening. She walked into the room alone. She read her declaration in a clear voice that did not shake. When the council members came forward one by one to kiss her hand, she received them with a composure that one observer described as astonishing in so young a person. Charles Greville, the clerk of the council, who had seen every kind of political performance in 30 years of service, wrote in his diary that night that she was perfectly composed, had a remarkable dignity, and that no one would have thought she was doing this for the first time. She was doing it for the first time. She had never attended a full Privy Council meeting, but the Kensington system had kept her away from the machinery of government on the theory that ignorance would make her dependent. What it had actually done was force her to study that machinery from the outside, through books and observation and the two-layered intelligence that the sick-room refusal had already demonstrated. She had been preparing for this room her entire life. She just had not been allowed to say so. There are 3 things that happened in the first 24 hours of Victoria's reign that tell you everything about who she actually was underneath the system that had tried to define her. The first was the Privy Council, already described. The second happened that afternoon, when she summoned her mother for a private conversation and informed the Duchess that she would henceforth have her own separate sitting room, not a separate palace, not a banishment, a room, a single room that was hers alone, where her mother did not have standing to enter without being invited. The Duchess, by multiple accounts, was devastated. Victoria was courteous, clear, and immovable. The third happened that evening. She had her bed moved into a room of her own. For the first time in 18 years, Victoria slept alone. No one on the other side of the mattress. No one to wake if she turned over. No breath in the room but her own. She did not write about this in her journal that night. She did not need to. Some freedoms are too large for sentences. Lord Melbourne came the next day. William Lamb, the second Viscount Melbourne, was 58 years old and the Prime Minister of England, and one of the most naturally charming men in the country, which in Victorian England meant he was also one of the most dangerous to a young woman with no experience of the world. He was witty, well-read, emotionally intelligent, and constitutionally incapable of delivering bad news without wrapping it in something easier to swallow. He had survived a career full of the kind of scandals that end careers by being, at bottom, a man that almost everyone found it difficult to dislike. Victoria adored him immediately. This was not complicated. She had spent 18 years in a house with a mother who monitored her, and a man who wanted to use her, and tutors who reported upward. Melbourne talked to her. He talked to her about history and politics and literature, and the characters of people she was about to meet. And he made her laugh. And he treated her opinions as worth having, even when he disagreed with them. He became, in the first months of her reign, the thing she had never been permitted to have, a person who was simply on her side. She met with him every day. She rode with him in the mornings. She sat with him at dinner. She wrote about him in her journal with a warmth that later readers would find striking. Not because there was anything improper in it, but because the warmth of a very young woman who has never been allowed to trust anyone, suddenly permitted to trust someone, is an overwhelming thing to read. Melbourne, for his part, was careful. He was a man who understood the weight of what was being placed on him, and he carried it with more seriousness than his public reputation might have suggested. He taught her. He explained the Constitution, the political parties, the personalities she would need to navigate, the difference between what a constitutional monarch could do and what she might want to do, and the art of finding the intersection of those two territories. He also, without quite intending to, did the thing that the Kensington system had done before him. He became indispensable. It would take a crisis to reveal this. The crisis was not long in coming. But before the crisis, there was a coronation, June 28th, 1838, Westminster Abbey. The ceremony had been practiced. But practice, it turned out, did not fully account for reality. The orb was handed to her at the wrong moment. The Archbishop forced the coronation ring onto the wrong finger, too tight, and Victoria had to spend 30 minutes after the service soaking her hand in ice water to remove it. One of the elderly lords, descending the steps after paying homage, stumbled and fell, and Victoria instinctively moved to help him, breaking protocol entirely. It was the breaking of protocol that the people who were there remembered. A girl of 19, in full coronation regalia, crown on her head, moving toward a fallen old man to see if he needed assistance. Because whatever she had been trained to be, she had also been trained to notice when someone needed help. She was queen. She was also, underneath everything, still herself. The Kensington system had tried to hollow that out. It had not succeeded. And in the years that followed, both of those facts, the crown and the self beneath it, would pull in directions that were not always the same. The trouble with Melbourne was not that he was a bad teacher. He was an exceptional teacher. The trouble was what he chose to leave out of the lessons. He taught Victoria politics the way a man teaches a subject he loves to a student he loves selectively, instinctively, always finding the version of events that was most interesting rather than most complete. He told her about people, their motivations and weaknesses and histories, with an accuracy that bordered on cruel and a delivery that made it feel like entertainment. He explained the Constitution with real care. He gave her, genuinely, a better foundation in the practical business of governing than most monarchs received. What he did not give her, could not quite bring himself to give her, was the full weight of what she was. She was the head of a constitutional monarchy in a country that was changing faster than any country had ever changed before. The Industrial Revolution was doing to England what nothing had done to it since the Norman conquest, rearranging everything. The distribution of wealth, the location of people, the nature of work, the balance of political power. The old aristocracy that had run the country for centuries was watching a new class of manufacturers and merchants accumulate fortunes that rivaled their own. And that new class wanted representation, and Parliament was the place where that want would eventually have to be accommodated. Melbourne understood all of this. He was not ignorant of it, but he was also a man of a certain generation, a certain class, a certain instinctive conservatism that made radical change feel like loss, even when he could see it was necessary. And because he loved Victoria and wanted her happy, he taught her the version of England that he found most comfortable, which was also the version that was quietly disappearing. She learned it beautifully. That was the problem. By 1839, Victoria was 20 years old. She had been queen for 2 years, and she was, in the assessment of the political class around her, alarmingly good at being queen in the ways that were visible and alarmingly naive in the ways that were not. She held audiences with confidence. She conducted correspondence with skill. She had opinions and she was not shy about them. She had also, in the assessment of the Tory opposition and several moderate Whigs and quite a few foreign observers, become so personally attached to Melbourne that she could no longer distinguish between her affection for the man and her judgment about his government. The crisis came in May of 1839. Melbourne's government, weakened by a series of political setbacks, lost a vote in the House of Commons and resigned. Protocol required Victoria to invite the leader of the opposition, Sir Robert Peel, to form a new government. She did so. Peel, methodical and precise where Melbourne was warm and instinctive, accepted, and then he made a request that was, by any political standard of the time, entirely reasonable. He asked Victoria to replace some of the ladies of the bedchamber. The ladies of the bedchamber were the women who attended the Queen in her private apartments, who travelled with her, who sat with her at meals, who were, in effect, her constant companions. Almost all of them were wives or relatives of prominent Whig politicians. Melbourne's people, Peel, forming a Tory government, wanted some of them replaced with women connected to his own party. This was normal. This was how things were done. Every Prime Minister made similar requests. Victoria refused. She refused with a firmness that startled Peel, who had not expected resistance on a matter he considered procedural. She told him the ladies were her personal household, not political appointments, and she would not change them. He pressed. She refused again. He told her that without this accommodation he could not form a government. She told him. In effect, that was his problem. Peel withdrew. Melbourne returned to power. Victoria had won. In the most direct sense, she had exerted the will of the Crown against the demands of a Prime Minister and prevailed. The Kensington system had spent years trying to make her compliant. And here, on the largest political stage in England, she was not compliant at all. But here is what the victory actually was. Stripped of the triumphant surface, she had used the power of the Crown to preserve a domestic arrangement she preferred, for personal reasons. The reason she did not want to change the ladies was that the ladies were connected to Melbourne, and Melbourne was the only person in her life who had ever made her feel safe. And she was not ready to lose that. It was the Kensington system all over again. Redecorated, she had escaped one form of dependence and walked directly into another, more comfortable one, and the people around her, the people who had watched Conroy operate, saw it clearly. The question that several of them began to ask, quietly, in correspondence and in private conversation, was the same question Conroy's ambitions had originally been built to answer. Victoria needed someone closer than a Prime Minister, someone inside the household, someone who would be honest with her when honesty was the thing she needed most and comfort was the thing she wanted. She needed, in a word that everyone was now saying out loud, a husband. The candidate had been identified years before, through the careful genealogical arithmetic of European royal politics. He was the son of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His name was Albert. He had visited England briefly in 1836, when both of them were 17, and Victoria had written in her journal that he was extremely handsome and full of goodness and sweetness. She had also noted his beautiful nose. He was coming back in October of 1839. The purpose of the visit was not stated explicitly by anyone. It did not need to be. Victoria knew. Albert knew. Melbourne knew. The Duchess of Kent knew. Conroy, watching from the diminishing distance that Victoria's freedom had put between them, knew. The question was not whether this meeting had a purpose. The question was what Victoria would decide to do with a man who had been sent to her for a reason. In a world where almost every person she had ever known had arrived in her life with a reason attached, She had spent her childhood learning to read reasons. She was 20 years old, and she was about to meet the man who would spend the next 21 years changing what she understood about the difference between what people wanted from her and what she might actually want for herself. Albert came in October. He came down the stairs at Windsor, and Victoria saw him. And she wrote in her journal that evening with the directness that was always her best quality when she let herself use it. It was not, she wrote, a letter she needed to think about. She had made up her mind. Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived in England, knowing exactly what he was there for. And he arrived anyway. That requires a moment of consideration, because it is easy to read what follows as a love story, which it was, and miss what it also was, a negotiation between two people who had both been shaped by constraint into something harder and more deliberate than their ages should have produced. Victoria was 20. Albert was 20. Between them, they had enough political education to understand that the visit had been arranged, that expectations existed on every side, and that whatever happened in the next few weeks would be decided not by the people who had done the arranging, but by the two people standing in the room. He came down the stairs at Windsor on the evening of October 10th, 1839, and Victoria was at the bottom, and she wrote about the moment that night with a precision that cuts through the formality of everything surrounding it. He was beautiful, she wrote, more beautiful than she had remembered from 3 years before. And there was something in his expression, something she struggled to name in her journal, and eventually described simply as goodness, that she had not expected to find in a man who had been sent to her for reasons. What Victoria did not write about, because she did not yet know how to see it, was what Albert was doing while she was forming these impressions. He was watching everything. Albert had grown up in Coburg, in a small German duchy that was grand enough to produce princes, but not grand enough to provide them with much beyond the title. His parents' marriage had been miserable and had ended in separation when he was 5 years old. He had been raised largely by a grandmother and tutored with an intensity that left him, by his early 20s, genuinely well educated in ways that the English aristocracy, which tended to regard too much learning as slightly suspicious, was not fully prepared for. He had studied philosophy, science, art, music, and political theory. He spoke 4 languages. He had opinions about industrial reform and the organization of museums and the architectural principles of public buildings. He had also grown up understanding, with a clarity that only people raised in precarious positions tend to develop, that intelligence without position is nearly invisible. The ability to think well means nothing if the structures around you provide no mechanism for those thoughts to matter. He was coming to England to marry a queen, which meant he was coming to England to occupy a position that had no historical precedent, no constitutional definition, and no clear authority. Husband of the Queen. What did that mean? Not king. English law was unambiguous on that point. Not consort in any sense that carried formal power. Not advisor. Not official. Not anything that had a job description or a salary or a role that the government was obligated to recognize. He would be the most visible man in England with no title that meant anything. Victoria proposed to him on October 15th, 1839. Because protocol required that no one could propose to the Queen, she wrote about it in her journal with a combination of formality and excitement that is completely endearing in retrospect. She told him that she knew it would make her too happy if he would consent to what she wished. He said yes. Then they talked for half an hour, and no one wrote down what they said. And that half hour of unrecorded conversation between two 20-year-olds who had just decided to change each other's lives is one of the more tantalizing silences in Victorian history. What followed the proposal was a masterclass in the social mechanics of the 19th century, and specifically in how much work was required to fit an unexpected person into an existing system. Parliament had to be informed. Albert had to be granted an income. There was a significant debate about how much that income should be, and the Tory opposition reduced it from the proposed £50,000 a year to £30,000, partly on fiscal grounds, and partly, it was widely understood, to signal that the German prince had not arrived with the full endorsement of the English political class. Then there was the question of precedence. Where did the husband of the Queen rank in formal processions and seating arrangements and every other ceremony that Victorian England used to make visible the hierarchy of power? The answer, it turned out, was that no one was sure, because nothing like this had happened before. It required a special order in council to establish that Albert walked immediately behind the Queen, not beside her. Behind. Albert absorbed all of this. He did not complain publicly. He did not write letters of protest. He watched, and he understood, and he began the patient, years-long process of making himself the kind of person that the system would eventually have to accommodate on his own terms rather than the terms it had initially assigned him. This is the thing about Albert that the romantic version of his story tends to underplay. He was not simply Victoria's devoted helpmate, the perfect prince consort who loved his wife and served his adopted country and died tragically young. He was a man of genuine intellectual ambition who found himself in a position with no formal power and responded by becoming expert at every informal form of it available to him. He started with Victoria. In the first months of their marriage, Albert had no access to the state papers that crossed Victoria's desk. She had not offered it, and he had not pushed for it, but he was present when she worked, and he listened, and he occasionally said something, and the something was often useful. And gradually, without any formal decision being made, his chair moved from across the room to beside her desk. And then he was reading the papers with her. And then he was drafting responses that she reviewed and signed. None of this was announced. There was no moment where Victoria declared that Albert was now her political partner. It accumulated, the way real influence always accumulates, through demonstrated usefulness, applied consistently over time. Melbourne watched this happen with a complicated mixture of emotions that he was too sophisticated to express directly. He had been the person beside Victoria. He had been the political education, the trusted voice, the man whose judgment she reached for when she was uncertain. Albert was not pushing him out. Albert was simply, gradually, becoming more necessary, and Melbourne, who was honest enough to know what he was watching, understood that the young man sitting at the desk with Victoria at 9 in the evening, working through correspondence that Melbourne had previously summarized for her the next morning, was doing something that could not be competed with. He was there. The marriage itself, on February 10th, 1840, was the first event in Victoria's life that was entirely her own. She had chosen this man, proposed to this man, and now she was marrying him in the Chapel Royal at St. Frou, James's palace. In a dress, she had also chosen herself, with a deliberateness that people who knew what Kensington had been like found quietly extraordinary. She wrote that night that she was the happiest woman alive. Albert wrote to his brother that evening that he was the luckiest man in the world. Their correspondence with their respective confidants in the first years of marriage is worth reading carefully. because it reveals something that the public portraits of the time, all dignity and composure and royal propriety, do not quite capture. These two people genuinely liked each other. They found each other interesting. They argued about things and changed each other's minds and laughed at things that were actually funny, rather than things that protocol required them to smile at. This was not nothing. In the world they lived in, where marriages at their level were generally arrangements between families and convenience between individuals. What Victoria and Albert had was genuinely unusual. It was also, in ways that would take years to fully reveal themselves, the most consequential relationship in 19th century Europe. Albert was going to change what a royal family meant. He had a vision of what the monarchy could be in an age of newspapers and photography and an expanding middle class that wanted something to admire, not remote and untouchable and dressed in pure authority, but present, domestic, visible, human, a family that looked like a family, parents who loved their children, a husband and wife who clearly meant it. He was going to build that image carefully. Over 20 years. With Victoria's full participation and with a genius for the symbolic that the 20th century would eventually package under a different name entirely, he was also going to work himself into the ground doing it. But that ending is 20 years away. And for now, it is 1840. And Albert is 20 years old, with a complicated title and a chair that has moved a few feet closer to the desk. And everything that will come from this is still unbuilt. On the morning of February 10th, 1840, Victoria put on a dress that would still be shaping weddings 2 centuries later. She was not trying to start a tradition. She was trying to show off some lace. The lace was Honiton, made by hand in the county of Devon, and it was in trouble. Industrial production had made machine-made lace cheap enough that the cottage industry responsible for Honiton, which had been one of the finest in England for 200 years, was dying. The women who made it had a skill that required years to develop and produce something that machines genuinely could not replicate. And it did not matter, because machines were faster and cheaper, and the market, left to itself, did not particularly care about irreplaceable skills. Victoria cared. Someone in her household brought the situation to her attention, and she was the kind of person who, once she understood that a decision she was making had consequences beyond the decision itself, adjusted the decision to account for the consequences. The wedding dress would be white. She decided, because white showed the Honiton lace to its best advantage, and she would order enough of the lace to employ 200 workers for months, and she would make sure that the dress was seen. It was seen, enormously seen. The wedding was not the closed ceremony that royal weddings had traditionally been. There were hundreds of guests, and an enormous public audience outside, and illustrations in every newspaper in England, and prints sold in shop windows, and discussed in drawing rooms, and read about in households that had never had occasion to think about Honiton lace before. White for a wedding dress, before Victoria, was not nothing. But it was not universal. Women of means wore silver, gold, rich colours. The idea that a wedding dress should be white, that white specifically carried the meaning of a wedding, was not yet the settled understanding it would later become. After Victoria, it began moving towards settled. The image of a queen in white travelled through the newspapers and the illustrated magazines and the print shop windows, and from there into the understanding of a generation of women who saw it and filed it somewhere that was not quite conscious, somewhere that would surface later when the occasion arose. And then those women had daughters, and the daughters did the same. 2 centuries of weddings later, the woman standing in front of a mirror in a white dress does not know where the white came from. This is what it means for a single choice to outlive the person who made it. The wedding itself was, by the accounts of everyone present, the most visibly emotional public event Victoria had yet produced. She cried during the ceremony. Albert, who was not a man who displayed feeling easily, was pale and clearly moved. Her mother cried. A significant portion of the assembled guests cried. England, reading about it the next morning over breakfast, decided it approved. This was not an accident. Albert had been thinking, already in those early months, about what the newspaper reports of the wedding would say, and what the illustrations would show, and what impression would be formed in the minds of people who were not in the chapel and would know about this marriage only through what the press chose to transmit. He had begun what would become, over the next 2 decades, the most sophisticated royal image operation in English history. Not sophisticated in the sense of manipulative, though some calculation was always involved, sophisticated in the sense of intentional, of understanding that images have consequences, and that the image of a royal family happy in its domestic arrangements had a different consequence than the image of a royal family impressive in its ceremonies. The first kind of image made people feel that the monarchy was theirs in some way. The second kind made them feel it was above them. Albert understood, with the clarity of someone who had come from outside the system and could therefore see it whole. Which of those 2 feelings was more durable? But that evening, the strategy was not the point. Victoria wrote in her journal that night, and no one was reading it anymore. And so she wrote without the double layer, without the protective surface for the supervisor she no longer had. She wrote about Albert. She wrote about the ceremony. And she wrote that this was the happiest day of her life. She had written something like that before, about good concerts and beautiful rides in the country, and moments with Melbourne that she had described with appropriate restraint. But this was different, and she knew it, and the journal shows her knowing it. She was not happy the way she had been happy at a concert, where the happiness lived in the music and ended when the music did. She was happy in a way that had a person at the center of it, a specific person who would be there when she woke up, and there at dinner, and there when the correspondence needed to be answered, and there, simply, in the way that mattered most, which was the way that had nothing to do with use, or purpose, or political arrangement. She had spent her entire childhood in a house full of people and been completely alone. She had spent 2 years as queen surrounded by advisers and lords and ladies in waiting and a prime minister who genuinely cared for her. And she had still, underneath all of it, been alone. The particular loneliness of someone who has never been permitted to choose who gets to be near them. On February 10th, 1840, for the first time in her life, she was not alone. The dress was put away after the wedding, carefully folded, wrapped in tissue paper, stored in conditions designed to preserve it. Victoria did not wear it again. She did not loan it out, or display it, or use it as a prop for any of the dozens of occasions that arose over the following decades when a powerful symbolic object might have been useful. She simply kept it for 61 years, through 9 children, and a reformation of what monarchy meant, and a grief that would redefine her public life, and an empire that expanded until it covered 1/4 of the earth. The white dress sat in its wrappings and waited. We know what it was waiting for, because she told us. She left instructions. And when the time came, in January of 1901, in a room without a camera on an island off the English coast, the dress was brought out of its storage and placed with her, along with the plaster cast of Albert's hand and the lock of his hair and the dressing gown that had hung on its hook for 40 years, she had turned a white dress into the dream of a generation. Then she had kept the original for herself. What comes between the wedding morning and that January night is the story of what that keeping cost. It begins, as the most expensive things always do, with something that looked, at first, like pure joy. Victoria hated being pregnant. She said so repeatedly, in her journal, in her letters, and eventually to her daughters when they were old enough to understand what she meant. She called it the shadow side of marriage. She described the physical experience with a frankness that was unusual for a queen and would have been considered improper in almost any other woman of her time and class. She told her oldest daughter, when that daughter was preparing for her own marriage, that the particular condition that followed wedding nights was the one thing she wished someone had warned her about more honestly. She had 9 children in 17 years. The first, a daughter named Victoria, but called Vicky, arrived in November of 1840, 9 months after the wedding. The last, a daughter named Beatrice, arrived in 1857. In between were Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Edward, who arrived in 1841 and would wait 59 years in increasing impatience to become King Edward VII. Victoria loved her children. This requires saying directly, because what follows might suggest otherwise. And the truth is more complicated than either simple maternal devotion or simple maternal ambivalence. She loved them with the full force of a personality that did not do anything by halves. And she also found infants ugly, and babies demanding, and small children exhausting in ways that cut against the image of serene motherhood that the world was already beginning to attach to her name. She used chloroform when giving birth to her 8th child, Leopold, and the decision was publicly debated in ways that tell you exactly what the Victorian era thought about women's pain. Some medical voices objected. Some religious voices objected. Victoria did not change her position. This was one of the rare occasions in her life when she did not care what the critics thought, and it mattered beyond her household, because her choice helped legitimize the use of pain relief in childbirth for women across England who had been told to simply endure. A queen's personal medical decision became policy by example. This kept happening, in different forms, across her entire reign, because here is what was happening simultaneously. In the newspapers and the illustrated magazines and the print shops and the drawing rooms of England and eventually of Europe and eventually of the world, the image of Victoria and Albert with their children was becoming the most reproduced domestic image of the 19th century. Albert had understood early that the camera, that strange new technology that was just becoming reliable enough to produce consistent results in the 1840s, was not simply a recording device. It was a storytelling device. What it told a story about depended entirely on what you put in front of it, and how you arranged what you put in front of it, and what you allowed to be seen, and what you kept outside the frame. He put his family in front of it. The photographs multiplied through the 1840s and 1850s. Victoria and Albert and the children at Osborne House, the holiday residence Albert had designed on the Isle of Wight. Victoria and Albert at Balmoral, the Scottish castle they built together. The children at various ages, in various arrangements. Family groups, informal moments, arranged to look informal. The message of every photograph was the same message. Transmitted without a word of caption, this is a family, not a dynasty, not a ruling house, not an ancient institution trailing centuries of ceremony and obligation. A family, the kind that sat together and had dogs and went on holidays and photographed their children growing up. This was a revolution disguised as a domestic scene, and it worked in proportion to how invisible the revolution was. The middle class of Victorian England, expanding and prospering and hungry for something to organize their values around, found in the image of the royal family a mirror for their own aspirations. This was not cynical on Victoria and Albert's part. They genuinely were the family they projected. The love was real. The domestic arrangements were real. Albert really did play with the children and help design their nurseries and involve himself in their education, with an attentiveness that even his critics found difficult to dismiss. Real things can also be useful things, and the image of the royal family as a model household, as the ideal form of the institution that the middle class was building its world around, was extraordinarily useful to a monarchy that was navigating the transition between a world where kings ruled by divine right and a world where kings ruled by public approval. Albert saw this connection. He built toward it consciously. Victoria, who was in many ways more instinctive and less systematic than her husband, understood it well enough to cooperate completely. Now there is one more thing that needs to be said about the children. It sounds like a detail. Follow it far enough, and it becomes something else entirely. Victoria sits at her writing desk on an autumn evening in the 1850s. She is writing to one of her daughters, or managing household correspondence, or reviewing state papers. The candles are lit. Albert is working nearby. The children are in their rooms upstairs. It is an ordinary evening in the most photographed household in England. She does not know that she is carrying something invisible, a variation in a single gene, passed to her from somewhere in her ancestry, that affects the blood's ability to clot. She has no symptoms. She will never know it is there. The science that could have told her does not yet exist. At least 3 of her 9 children inherited it. Leopold, her 8th child, had it severely and spent his life under serious physical restriction because of it. 2 of her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, carried it without being fully affected, the way Victoria herself carried it. Those daughters married into royal families. Their children married into royal families. And the gene travelled through the carefully arranged dynastic network that Victoria and Albert were building as a deliberate policy of European peace, into households across the continent. One of Alice's daughters was named Alex. She grew up to marry Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, and became Alexandra Feodorovna, Empress of Russia. Her son Alexei, heir to the Romanov throne, had the condition around Alexei's illness, around his mother's desperate need for someone who could help her child. A Siberian mystic named Rasputin built an influence over the Russian imperial family that helped poison the court's relationship with its own country at precisely the moment when that relationship could least afford to be poisoned. Victoria's gene did not cause the Russian Revolution. A single genetic variation does not explain what happened to Russia between 1917 and 1921. But the gene moved through her children into the body of a boy whose illness shaped a court, and a court whose dysfunction shaped a revolution, and a revolution that changed the world. It travelled without her knowledge. It travelled without her permission. It travelled because she loved her children and arranged their futures carefully and wanted the best for them and for Europe. Victoria closes the letter. The candles are still burning. Upstairs, the children are asleep. Albert, looking up from his own work, asks if she is finished for the night. She is. They go upstairs together. On the 1st of May, 1851. The doors of the Crystal Palace opened, and the future walked in, or at least, that is what England told itself. The building that had risen in Hyde Park over the previous months was unlike anything that had been constructed before, a structure of prefabricated cast iron and plate glass. Designed by a man named Joseph Paxton, who had begun his career as a head gardener and discovered along the way that he had a gift for building things made of glass and iron, covering nearly 1 million square feet of parkland, tall enough that the elm trees of Hyde Park stood inside it rather than being removed for its construction. The trees stood there in the finished building, living, growing, inside an enclosed space that was also somehow the outdoors, and that image of nature contained within an architecture of industry said more about what England thought it was doing in 1851 than any number of official speeches. Albert had made this happen. That requires emphasis, because Albert spent much of his time in England in a position of official invisibility that made his actual influence difficult to account for in any formal record. He could not be called the organizer of the Great Exhibition in any document that needed to be legally precise, because he held no official title that gave him organizing authority. What he was, technically, was the president of the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations. What that meant, practically, was that he had done most of the work. He had conceived the scope of it. He had assembled the commission. He had managed the political opposition. And there had been substantial political opposition from people who thought that bringing hundreds of thousands of foreigners to London would result in revolution, or disease, or the corruption of English morals, or some combination of all three. He had dealt with the logistical problems of designing and constructing an entirely new kind of building on a site in central London while maintaining access to the park. He had done this while simultaneously continuing to manage the Queen's correspondence and advise her on state matters and raise 9 children and maintain a public schedule that would have exhausted a man in perfect health. Albert was not in perfect health. He had never been in perfect health in England. He was prone to stomach complaints and respiratory infections in ways that the English climate exacerbated and that he managed largely by not stopping. He did not believe in stopping. He believed in work the way some men believe in religion, as the organizing principle around which everything else arranges itself, as the answer to doubt and the response to pain, and the proof that existence is not merely being experienced, but being earned. Victoria worried about this. She wrote about it in her letters to her uncle Leopold in Belgium, to the small circle of people she trusted with her actual thoughts rather than the performed version of her thoughts. Albert works too hard, she wrote, in various formulations, across many years. She could see it. She could not stop it. Albert's relationship with work was part of who he was, in the same way that Victoria's relationship with feeling was part of who she was, and telling him to rest more would have been about as effective as someone telling her to feel less. But on May the 1st, 1851, none of that was the story. The story was the building and what it contained. Walk through it, because the contents matter. The Crystal Palace held more than 100,000 objects from around the world, organized by country and then by category, and walking through it was the closest thing the 19th century produced to what we might now call an experience of globalization made physical. You could move from English steam engines, massive and deafening and incomprehensible in their power, to French silks, to Indian jewels, to American agricultural machinery, to Ottoman furniture, to Sheffield steel, to Bohemian glass, all in the same afternoon, all under the same roof of glass and iron, all organized by the principle that the world's production was a single thing that could be surveyed and compared and celebrated. The Koh-i-Noor diamond was there, recently acquired from the Punjab following the annexation of the Sikh territories, displayed in a specially constructed cage of golden wire so that visitors could walk around it. More than 6 million people came to see it, and everything else over the 5 months the exhibition was open. 6 million. In a country whose total population was not yet 21 million, what did they see? They saw the argument that industry was progress, that the ability to make things faster and in larger quantities than had ever been possible before was inherently good, that the machine was the future and the future was improvement. They also saw, in every section of colonial goods displayed as the raw material of civilization, the argument that empire was the mechanism by which the world's resources became the world's products. Cotton from India, manufactured into cloth in Manchester, ivory from Africa, made into piano keys in Birmingham. The Crystal Palace contained the entire circuit of empire in miniature. Presented as a spectacle of abundance, Albert saw progress. He saw, genuinely and without significant complication, a vision of what human industry and international cooperation could achieve. He was not a stupid man or a dishonest one, and his optimism about what the exhibition represented was sincere. This is not a defense of every consequence of that optimism. It is a description of what it means to be entirely inside your own historical moment, to believe in the story you are telling, because you have not yet lived to see where it ends. Victoria walked through the Crystal Palace on opening day and wrote that she was moved to tears. The building, the crowds, the sense of something unprecedented. She held Albert's arm, and for once, the public position, the fact that he was beside her rather than behind her, matched what was actually true. He had built this. She walked through it holding his arm, and she knew he had built it, and the tears were partly for the building and partly for him. He was at his peak that day. He was 31 years old, and the most effective, unofficial minister any English government had in the 19th century, and the architect of the most visited public exhibition England had ever produced. And he was walking through it with his wife, who was also his queen, and who was, at that particular moment, simply proud of him. 10 years later he would be dead, but the machinery he had set in motion, not the Crystal Palace, which was dismantled and moved to South London after the exhibition closed, but the other machine, the image machine, the family machine, the project of making monarchy mean something in an age that was running out of reasons to need it, would continue. It would survive him. It would become so embedded in what a royal family looked like and how it behaved and what it owed the public in the way of visibility and human interest that 2 centuries later, people would still be arguing about whether members of a royal family were allowed to step back from their public roles, as if the obligation he had built was a natural feature of the landscape rather than something a German prince had invented in the 1840s because he needed to find a way to be useful. He had built it to last. He did not build it to last without him. That distinction would matter enormously in December of 1861, and it would matter in ways that neither of them had planned for. But in 1851, standing in the middle of what he had made, he did not know that yet. Only we know that. Somewhere in the royal collection there is a photograph from the 1840s. Victoria and Albert sit together in a well-furnished room at Osborne House. The children are arranged around them. Everyone is dressed carefully. The light is good. The composition is deliberate without looking deliberate. which is the hardest thing to achieve in a photograph, and the thing Albert had become very good at achieving. It is a perfect image of a perfect family. In the same decade, on the other side of the Irish Sea, 1 million people died of starvation. Another million left for America. Set those two images next to each other and do not rush past them. The explanation comes later. The images come first, because the images are what the people living through this moment actually experienced. And the images did not come with explanations attached. Ireland in the 1840s was a country that had been under English rule for centuries, a rule that had dispossessed the Catholic majority of land and political rights through a series of laws that even many English observers acknowledged were difficult to defend. The land was owned largely by English and Anglo-Irish landlords, many of whom lived in England and collected rents through agents. The Irish peasantry, millions of people, had become, over generations of dispossession and consolidation, dependent on a single crop, the potato. The potato blight arrived in 1845. It was a water mold that had crossed the Atlantic from North America and moved through Europe with a speed and completeness that no one had seen before. It destroyed the potato crop. It destroyed it again in 1846. The failure was not partial. It was total. Fields that had been green in late summer turned black and rotting in days. And the smell of it. The smell of a country's food supply decomposing in the ground. Carried for miles. People began to die. The British government's response was shaped by the economic philosophy of the time, which held that the market was the proper mechanism for addressing scarcity and that government intervention in food distribution would create dependency and distort prices. Food continued to be exported from Ireland to England during the famine years, because the food belonged to the landlords who owned the land, and the market said it should go where the price was highest. And the price was highest in England. About 1 million people died. The number is approximate because no one counted carefully. The people who were dying were not the people doing the counting. Another 1.5 million emigrated in the famine years alone, and emigration continued for decades afterward, until Ireland's population, which had been over 8 million before the famine, had fallen by half. They went primarily to the United States, packed into ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that many never reached America alive. They arrived in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, carrying almost nothing except the knowledge of what had happened to them and a relationship with England that would shape Irish-American identity for generations. Many people watching this are descended from those ships. Victoria was not unaware of the famine. She was briefed on it. She received reports. She made a donation to famine relief of £2,000, a sum that was reported in the newspapers as an act of royal generosity. She visited Ireland in 1849, after the worst of the famine was over, and was received with a warmth that surprised her. She wrote that the Irish were a very peculiar people and very emotional, which tells you something about the distance between what she was seeing and what she was understanding. She was not cruel. She was not indifferent in the way that requires active effort to maintain indifference. She was a woman who received reports and read summaries and looked at a country from the distance that power, even in the Victorian era, naturally creates. The distance was the thing, not malice. Distance. The same distance that made it possible to sit for a family photograph in Osborne House and not fully connect that image to the ships crossing the Atlantic. The distance that an empire runs on, that it requires in order to function, that it maintains through 1,000 small mechanisms of abstraction, turning people into numbers, turning numbers into policies, turning policies into something that can be discussed over breakfast without interrupting the meal. What the image of the royal family did. Through the photographs and the illustrated newspapers and the carefully managed visibility that Albert had constructed, was make the empire feel like a family endeavor, decent, domestic, undertaken by people who loved their children and kept familiar rituals and believed themselves to be decent. The image machine was very good at producing certain kinds of visibility and very good, simultaneously, at producing certain kinds of invisibility. What it showed and what it did not show were both choices. Even when neither choice was explicitly made, Ireland was not the only place where the distance between the family portrait and the reality outside the frame was measured in human lives. In Bengal, in Jamaica, in the Cape Colony, in places whose names did not appear in the newspapers, Victoria read over breakfast, where the business of empire was conducted by men, acting in the name of the crown, without the crown ever being asked to look directly at what was being done. A face that never turns toward what is happening behind it is still part of what is happening behind it. This is not comfortable. It was not comfortable in 1851. For the people who could see it clearly. It is not comfortable now. History does not become comfortable simply because it recedes what the image of Victoria and Albert protected, without meaning to, without designing to, was a certain way of not looking, of receiving reports and reading summaries and accepting the abstractions that turned the cost of empire into a number in a column, rather than a person standing in a field watching the potato crop turn black. Victoria was not the empire. She was its face. There is a difference, and the difference matters. And the difference also has limits, because a face that is always pleasant and never troubled is already saying something about what lies behind it, whether it intends to or not. The family portrait sat on walls across England. The ships kept crossing the Atlantic. Both things were true at the same time, in the same world, under the same flag. The people on the ships carried that flag's shadow with them to a new country and never entirely put it down. Their great-grandchildren are still here. In the summer of 1844, a photographer was admitted to Windsor Castle, set up his equipment in the sunlight of one of the larger rooms, and made a photographic portrait of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, and their eldest daughter. The process took several minutes. Everyone had to hold still. The result was a slightly blurred image of three people arranged carefully in front of a camera, two of them adults with the practiced composure of people accustomed to sitting for portraits, and one of them a small child, doing her best. Victoria was 25. She had been queen for 7 years. She had sat for dozens of painted portraits and hundreds of drawn likenesses, and had been reproduced in engravings and on coins and in illustrated newspapers across the English-speaking world. But this was different. This was a photograph, and photography was different from everything that had come before it. And Albert understood why immediately, and Victoria understood it slightly later, and together they grasped something that most of their contemporaries were still working out. A painting was a record of what a painter saw and chose to show. A photograph was a record of what had actually been in front of the camera. The distinction sounds philosophical until you think about what it means for a royal family trying to construct a relationship with a public that would never meet them in person. A painting of the royal family looking warm and domestic was a painting of the royal family looking warm and domestic. A photograph of the royal family looking warm and domestic was, in the understanding of everyone who looked at it, evidence that the royal family was warm and domestic. The camera could lie, as every subsequent century of photography has demonstrated conclusively, but in the 1840s and 1850s, when the technology was new and its possibilities for construction and selection were not yet widely understood, it felt like proof. Albert was building a proof. The photographs multiplied through the 1840s and 1850s. Victoria and Albert and the children at Osborne. Victoria and Albert at Balmoral. The children at various ages in various arrangements. Family groups. Individual portraits. Informal moments, arranged to look informal. What Albert understood and communicated to Victoria in the practical language of decisions rather than theory was that the photograph was not a record of the royal family as they were. It was an argument about who they were. The argument was made not through words, but through composition and setting and expression, and what was included in the frame and what was left outside it. The setting chosen was almost always domestic. Not the throne room, not the state apartments, not the ceremonial spaces that announced power and distance. Sitting rooms, gardens, the kind of rooms that middle-class families also had, furnished in the kind of style that middle-class families also aspired to. The message was not that the royal family lived like everyone else, because no one was pretending that. The message was that the royal family organized its private life around the same values that everyone else organized their private lives around. Home, children, husband and wife together. Victoria became extraordinarily good at this, better in some ways than Albert, because she brought to it something that Albert, with his systematic intelligence, sometimes lacked: instinctive, emotional authenticity. She was not performing warmth in the photographs. She was warm, and the camera recorded the warmth, and the result was an image that communicated something real, even when the arrangement around it was entirely calculated. She was also, and this is something that gets underemphasized, genuinely interested in photography as a technology. She learned how it worked. She learned what produced a good result and what did not. She had opinions about lighting and composition and which poses were flattering and which were not. She built up a collection of photographs over her lifetime that numbered in the thousands, of her family, of people she met, of places she visited, of events she attended. The collection was a private archive of her life, organized by the technology she had watched be invented. This is the thing about Victoria and the modern world that is hardest to fully see, because we are so far inside the world she helped shape. She was not following a script for how a modern public figure manages their image, because no such script existed yet. She was writing it, not consciously, not in the sense of sitting down and deciding what modernity needed from its public figures, but through the accumulation of choices, each reasonable on its own, each producing an effect that compounded with the effects of the other choices, until the result was a new way of being visible that had not existed before she demonstrated it. A royal family that looked like a family, a marriage that looked like a marriage, a grief that would look like a grief, when it came, of the kind that ordinary people recognized because they had felt it themselves. The word for what Albert was building and Victoria was inhabiting is one that belongs to a later century. But the thing itself was already present in every decision they made about which photographs to distribute and which ceremonies to attend and how to arrange themselves in public. It ran on recognition rather than reverence, on affection rather than awe. Recognition is a more durable thing than reverence. You can reverence something you have never seen. You can recognize only something that has shown itself to you. And recognition, once established, creates an attachment that survives the disappointments that reverence cannot survive. The monarchy that Albert built and Victoria inhabited was going to face enormous disappointments in the decades ahead. Absences that lasted too long. Relationships that the public found difficult to process. decisions that cost political goodwill that had taken years to accumulate, and it was going to survive all of them, because Albert had built it on recognition rather than reverence, on the photograph in the sitting room rather than the portrait in the throne room. He built it to last without a monarch who was always present and always performing. He built it to survive a queen who might, under sufficient pressure, disappear. That turned out to be exactly the kind of monarch he was going to leave behind. One November evening in 1859, Albert came in from a day of work looking worse than usual. He had been unwell for years, in the low-grade way of a man who does not rest and does not say when something is wrong, and trusts that the body will manage itself if the will is strong enough. Victoria noted in her journal that he seemed tired. She had been noting for years that he seemed tired. She noted it, and they had dinner, and the next morning he went back to work. 2 years later he would be dead. She did not know that. She was writing about how tired he looked, not about what the tiredness meant, because she did not yet know what it meant, and the not knowing is a thing she would carry for the rest of her life. The ordinary evening that turned out to be one of the last ordinary evenings, recorded in the journal, with the mild concern of a wife who expected her husband to recover, as he always had before, and get up the next morning and go back to work. He always had before. On the morning of December 14th, 1861, Victoria was called to Albert's bedside at Windsor Castle, and she took his hand, and he died. He was 42 years old. The official diagnosis was typhoid fever, contracted from the notoriously poor drainage system at Windsor, which Albert himself had been lobbying to have improved for years. Later, doctors and historians have raised questions about whether other conditions may have contributed, whether the illness was the final weight on a body already failing from something else. The medical questions continue for Victoria, standing at the bedside in the December morning light. The diagnosis did not matter. The fact beneath the diagnosis was the only fact that existed. He was gone. She was 42 years old. She had been married for 21 years. She had 9 children. She ruled the largest empire in human history, and the only person in the world who had ever talked to her as though she was simply a person, rather than a queen or a symbol or a political problem or a vessel for other people's ambitions, had just stopped breathing. What followed is one of the most documented griefs in history, because Victoria was a woman who had always processed her interior life through writing, and she kept writing even when what she was writing was almost too painful to record. She wrote in her journal. She wrote to her uncle Leopold in Belgium, who had known Albert since his childhood, and who was one of the few people who could receive the full weight of what she was feeling without flinching. She wrote to her daughter Vicky, married now to the Crown Prince of Prussia and living in Berlin, who had inherited her mother's habit of putting everything into words. Through the writing, the shape of the grief becomes visible. Albert's clothes were laid out each morning, as they had been when he was alive. The valet who had performed this service for 21 years continued to perform it. Hot water was brought to his dressing room each morning so that it would be ready when he came to shave. He did not come. The hot water was removed untouched. The next morning it was brought again. This continued for years. Not weeks. Not months. Years. His blotting paper was left on his desk exactly as he had left it on the last day he worked. The pen was where he had put it down. Papers he had been working on remained in the position he had placed them. Victoria moved through the parts of Windsor that he had occupied with a carefulness that was not quite the carefulness of grief, though it contained grief, and not quite the carefulness of preservation, though it contained that too. It was something more like the behavior of someone who has decided that the world stopped at a particular moment and that it is possible, through sufficient attention to the material details of that moment, to remain inside it. She slept with a cast of his hand. She had had the cast made early in the marriage, one of those gestures of sentimental preservation that seem strange at a distance and make complete sense if you have ever lost someone so suddenly that you cannot remember, in the aftermath, what their hands actually felt like. She had kept it for 20 years as a memento. After he died, she took it to bed. The plaster hand was there every night in the place where the actual hand had been. She knew the difference. She kept the cast anyway. The bedroom arrangements she specified on the side of the bed where Albert had slept. His nightclothes were placed each evening, pressed and ready. A photograph of him was positioned on the pillow. She could see it from her side. Do not soften this. Do not explain it away as eccentricity or as the exaggerated sentimentality of the Victorian era. This was a woman who had spent her childhood without anyone to be near, who had found in one person the experience of not being alone for the first time in her life, and who had had that person taken from her at 42, and who was responding to the removal of that person with everything she had, which was, as always, with Victoria, considerably. She also, in the immediate days after his death, nearly stopped eating. The children, her household, her doctors, all moved through the corridors of Windsor in a state of controlled alarm that the letters of the period document clearly. The older children gathered. The younger ones were managed by nurses and governesses and kept from the worst of what was happening in their mothers' rooms. Victoria received them when she could. She was not a woman who abandoned her children in her grief. She was a woman who had been destroyed and who was trying to function anyway. And the trying was visible, and it cost her enormously, and the children saw it costing her, and what they understood from watching it would shape their relationships with her for the rest of their lives in ways that were not always simple. Albert had been the mediating presence between Victoria's intensity and the children's need for something they could approach without being overwhelmed. Without him, there was no mediation. There was only Victoria, raw and exposed and doing her best, which was sometimes more than enough, and sometimes, for particular children on particular days, not quite what was needed. She had the room where he died, the Blue Room at Windsor, kept exactly as it was. It was maintained, cleaned, aired, the fire lit in the grate as it had been lit when he was alive. His things remained in it. For the rest of her life, when she was at Windsor, she spent time in that room. She also continued to work. This is the part of the story of Victoria's grief that is easiest to overlook, because the external details of the grief are so arresting. The empty chair, the laid-out clothes, the cast of the hand, the 39 years of black mourning dress that followed. The red boxes of state papers arrived at Windsor every day, as they had always arrived. She opened them, she read them, she signed the documents that needed her signature. She wrote her responses in a hand that her secretaries later described as changed, more jagged, the pen pressing harder than it used to, but legible and present, and engaged with what it was responding to. She was the Queen of England. England did not stop because Albert had died. She did not stop. She kept the machine running with the part of herself that the grief had not reached. And the part it had reached, she kept in the bedroom, with the cast of his hand, and the untouched hot water, and the photograph on the pillow. What she could not do, for a long time, was appear. The public appearances, the ceremonies, the openings of Parliament, the reviews of troops, the visits to public institutions that were the visible currency of monarchy. She withdrew from, not entirely and not permanently, but substantially and for long enough that England began to notice, and then to comment, and then to ask a question that had not been asked about the monarchy in a long time. What is a queen who is not seen? She had no answer yet. The answer would come, but it would take years, and it would come from unexpected places, and one of the places it would come from was a Scottish hillside, and a man who had absolutely no patience for a queen who had forgotten how to be a person. For now, December 14th, 1861, Windsor Castle, the Blue Room. Outside the room the Empire waited, and inside the room Victoria sat with him for a long time before she would let them take him away. She was 42. She would live for 39 more years. Every single one of those years. She would wear black. She had known for 21 years what it was not to be alone. Now she knew again what it was. And the knowing, this time, was the thing that made everything different from everything that had come before, including Kensington, including the long supervised years, including every form of loneliness she had survived and written about and filed away in a journal that no one was allowed to read. The Empire waited. Parliament waited. The newspapers waited. The public waited. Victoria did not care. The letters began arriving at Buckingham Palace within weeks. Some of them were expressions of condolence, genuine and brief. The kind of letter that people write when someone has died and they want to say something and do not know what to say. These were manageable. They could be acknowledged by the household with a printed card and filed. The other letters were harder to file. They were letters from people who wanted to know when the Queen would be returning to her duties, when she would open Parliament, when she would be seen in London, when she would, in the formulation that began appearing in the press, and then in political correspondence, and then eventually in parliamentary debate. Do what queens were for. England in 1862 was a country in a particular kind of confusion. It had spent 22 years building an attachment to the image of its monarchy that ran deeper than anything the previous 2 centuries of English royal history had produced. Albert had done his work well. The royal family was not merely respected or feared or tolerated by the English public. It was, in a way that was relatively new to the institution, loved, not by everyone, but by enough people, and with enough genuine feeling, that the love had become part of the political weather. Love, however, has expectations that reverence does not. Reverence asks only that the object of reverence continue to exist in the appropriate, elevated position. Love asks to be acknowledged. Love asks to be present to the person who is loved. Love, specifically, asks to see the person. Victoria was not present. She remained at Windsor, or at Balmoral, or at Osborne, cycling between her private residences in a pattern determined by her grief and the management of her health, which had become fragile in ways that her doctors worried about in careful language, designed not to alarm anyone further. She attended no public ceremonies. She did not open Parliament in person in 1862 or 1863. She was available to her ministers. She conducted the business of government through the boxes and the correspondence, but she was not visible. And in the contract that Albert had built between the monarchy and the public, visibility was the central term. The newspapers, which had been largely reverential about the grief in the immediate months after Albert's death, began to shift. Punch, the satirical magazine that was the closest thing Victorian England had to a thermometer of middle-class opinion, ran a series of pieces. The phrase, the widow of Windsor, began to appear, first in private letters, and then, with increasing frequency, in print. It was not an insult, exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than an insult. It was an accurate description of what Victoria had become, and accuracy, when it strips a title down to its human content, can be more devastating than mockery. And then, in places where the editors of Punch would not have expected to find themselves in agreement with their readership, the harder question emerged. If the function of the monarchy was ceremonial, symbolic, the visible embodiment of the nation's continuity and its values, then what was a monarchy that was not visible? What did England pay for? Exactly, if not for a queen who would appear at the occasions that required a queen to appear. The Republican argument in England had never been strong, not since the Commonwealth of the 1650s, which had not recommended itself sufficiently to survive, but it had never entirely disappeared either, and in the early 1870s it found a voice in a parliament where several members were willing to say in public what many more were thinking in private. Charles Dilke, a Liberal MP, delivered a speech in 1871 that catalogued the cost of the monarchy to the public purse and asked what value was being received in return. He did not call for a republic outright. He did not need to. The question, once asked in the House of Commons and reported in every newspaper in England, did the askings work on its own? Victoria's household was alarmed. Her ministers were alarmed. Her son Bertie, Prince of Wales, who was very publicly and very energetically doing the things that his mother was not doing, attending races and dinners and ceremonies, and being seen at events across London with a sociability that was partly natural disposition and partly the filling of a vacuum, was also alarmed, though for reasons that mixed genuine concern for his mother with genuine concern for what the Republican question might mean for the throne he was eventually going to inherit. What none of them fully understood yet, though some were beginning to sense it, was what Victoria's absence was actually doing to the public imagination. A symbol that is always present becomes background. It is there, acknowledged, incorporated into the landscape, but it is not noticed in the specific urgent way that something is noticed when it might not be there. A symbol that disappears is a symbol that people suddenly become conscious of having. The absence creates an awareness that the presence, taken for granted, had never quite managed. The letters asking when Victoria would return to public life were not only expressions of frustration or impatience. Some of them were expressions of something more complicated, a realization produced by the absence of how much the person had meant, of how much the image had come to occupy in the imagination of people who had never met her and never would. Victoria, in her grief, had become more present in the minds of ordinary English people than she had been in any of the years of careful image management. The family portrait had built affection. The absence had revealed the depth of it. This was not a strategy. Victoria was not managing her absence for effect. She was grieving. The effect was a consequence of the grief, not a product of calculation. And the distinction matters because it tells you something important about how the image Albert had built actually functioned. He had built it on something real. When it broke, when the real thing underneath the image was damaged, the image broke with it in a way that a purely constructed image might not have. And the breaking, because it was real, produced a public response that a constructed absence could not have produced. England grieved with her because England could see that she was actually grieving. But there was a limit. A symbol requires a visible referent, and by the mid-1860s, Victoria's absence had lasted long enough that the question was no longer only about sympathy for her grief. It was about whether the monarchy could sustain a continued and indefinite withdrawal from the functions that justified its existence. The person who began to solve this problem was not a prime minister, not a constitutional theorist, not a member of her household with a plan. He was a Scotsman named John Brown, who had been working with Victoria's horses at Balmoral since she had been coming to Scotland, and who had no patience whatsoever for a woman who was sitting in her rooms when there were horses outside and hills to ride. He was not diplomatic about this view. He was also, as it turned out, exactly what was needed, not because he understood the political problem of the widow of Windsor, which he almost certainly did not and would not have cared about if he had, but because he understood, with the directness of someone who has no reason to pretend otherwise, that Victoria was still alive, and that being alive carries its own obligations. Obligations that grief cannot indefinitely suspend without cost. He was going to remind her of that. He was going to do it in ways that alarmed her household and scandalized parts of her court and gave the press enough material for years. And he was going to succeed. In the end, not because he was wise in some grand philosophical sense, but because he was there. And he was honest. And those two things together were rarer in her life than any particular wisdom would have been. The cold came off the hills at Balmoral in the autumn of 1864, and John Brown brought the horses around, and he told the Queen it was time to go out. She went. John Brown was not a romantic scandal. He was something the Victorian court had no category for a man who spoke to the Queen as though she were a person. He had come into Victoria's orbit gradually, the way people who become indispensable usually do, through demonstrated usefulness in a specific and limited role that expands over time into something no one had originally planned for. He had worked at Balmoral since the early 1850s, first as a general outdoor servant, and then, recognizing that he had a particular gift with horses and a particular ability to manage the temperamental logistics of outdoor expeditions on Scottish terrain. As Victoria's personal attendant on her rides and walks, Albert had approved of him. Albert, who had a systematic eye for competence, had noticed that Brown was competent in ways that went beyond horsemanship. He was reliable. He did not perform deference in the elaborate way that most of the household performed it. He was simply, plainly, practically useful. After Albert died, Brown remained at Balmoral. He was part of the landscape of the one place where Victoria felt most herself. And in the autumn of 1864, when her doctors and her household had decided that what she needed most was fresh air and physical movement and some intervention with the withdrawal that was alarming everyone, it was Brown who was sent to bring the horses around. He brought them around. He told her it was time to ride. She went. Not because the argument was philosophically compelling, because he had said it in the flat, unsentimental manner of someone who had already assumed the answer was yes and was simply waiting for her to catch up. What followed over the next several years defies the categories that the Victorian court kept trying to apply to it. Brown became Victoria's personal attendant not just at Balmoral but everywhere, a position that had no precedent and no official title for most of its existence. He travelled with her. He attended her at court. He stood outside her door. He managed the logistics of her daily existence with an efficiency that her household acknowledged, even when everything else about him made them deeply uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable to them for reasons that were partly about class, and partly about access, and partly about something harder to name, which was that he did not behave as though the court's opinion of him was a thing he needed to take into account. He spoke to her with a roughness that courtiers could not imitate, and would not have dared to attempt. His power was not rank, it was access, and the specific kind of access that comes from being the person who says what needs to be said when everyone else in the room has calculated that, saying it is too risky. When she spent too much time in the rooms where Albert's things were kept, he said it was time to come out. When she was not eating enough, he said she should eat. When the grief pulled her back into the rooms and the rituals and the carefully maintained artifacts of a life that had ended, he applied the ordinary remedy of practical attention. She did not always like this. There are letters in which she describes him as vexing. There are diary entries where his directness is recorded with an edge that suggests it landed harder than she wanted to admit. But she kept him. For nearly 20 years, from the mid-1860s to his death in 1883, she kept him in a position of daily access to her life that no one else, after Albert, had occupied. The court hated this. The family, with some exceptions, hated this. Bertie, the Prince of Wales, hated it with a consistency that was one of the few entirely predictable features of his otherwise unpredictable personality. The newspapers found in it an inexhaustible source of material. The rumours were immediate, and they were everywhere. A queen and a servant, alone together. Frequently, for years, the Victorian imagination, which was capable of the most elaborate prudishness and the most inventive speculation simultaneously, applied itself to the situation with enthusiasm. There were pamphlets, there were satirical pieces, there was a persistent story, circulating in certain circles for years, that Victoria had secretly married Brown in some private ceremony. The evidence for anything beyond what is visible in the documented record is thin. The documented record shows a woman who had lost the one person who talked to her like a person, and who had found, in the decades after that loss, another person who did the same, and who held on to that with the grip of someone who understands exactly what it costs to lose it. What Brown gave her was not what Albert had given her. Albert had given her intellectual partnership, political collaboration, the architecture of a shared life built over 20 years. Brown gave her something simpler and in some ways more urgent. He gave her the experience of being a person in a body on a particular day, in a particular weather. Rather than a symbol processing her grief in rooms decorated with the artifacts of a man who was gone, he got her outside. He got her moving. He got her eating and riding and engaging with the physical world in ways that her household had been trying and failing to achieve for years. He did this not by understanding her psychologically or by being particularly emotionally sophisticated, but by being entirely unimpressed by the reasons why she should stay inside. The court could not do this. The court operated on a grammar of deference that made directness impossible. Every interaction with Victoria went through layers of protocol and hierarchy, and the management of her moods and the fear of her displeasure that had built up over years. No one in that system could say, simply, "Come out. It is time to ride." The system was not built for that sentence. Brown was not in the system in the way the system understood itself. He was adjacent to it, employed by it, dependent on it for his position, but he operated according to a different set of rules that he had apparently carried with him from the Scottish hills and never found a compelling reason to exchange. He died in March of 1883 at Windsor, where he had been stationed for years. Victoria's response is recorded in her journal, and the language she used was the language of grief, the same register she had used when Albert died. Not the same, because nothing was the same as Albert, but in the same register. The court understood what that meant, and their discomfort with what it meant was visible in how they handled everything that followed. When Victoria died in 1901, the instructions she left for her coffin contained a request that was carried out in secret by the household members she had specifically named. Without the knowledge of Edward VII, a lock of John Brown's hair was placed in her left hand, wrapped in tissue paper, concealed beneath a bouquet of flowers so that it would not be visible when the coffin was inspected. Edward would not have permitted it. Edward, who had spent years watching Brown occupy a position in his mother's life that he found inexplicable and infuriating, who had, as one of his first acts after her death, ordered the removal of every photograph of Brown from every royal residence, would not have allowed the hair into the coffin. Victoria knew this. She made arrangements accordingly. The lock of hair went into the ground with her. This is the detail that the scandal-focused version of the John Brown story always misses, because it is looking for evidence of one particular kind of relationship and missing the evidence of another kind entirely. The intimacy that put the hair in the coffin was not about romance. It was about something that Victoria had been searching for since Kensington, a person who did not need anything from her except that she continue to exist, in a life that had contained everything this story has described so far, that had turned out to be one of the rarest things available to her. She valued it enough to make sure it went into the ground with her, quietly, past the person who would have stopped it. Nobody told Edward. Benjamin Disraeli sent Victoria primroses. He sent them with notes written in a style that no other Prime Minister had ever used with her. Warm and literary and faintly theatrical. The style of a man who understood that the distance between a sovereign and her First Minister could be managed by the quality of the language crossing it. He called her his fairy queen in private correspondence. He told her that he lived only to serve her. He said things that, from any other politician in the Victorian system, would have sounded ridiculous. From Disraeli they did not sound ridiculous. They sounded like what they were, which was a man of exceptional intelligence, choosing his words with exceptional care, because he understood something about Victoria that most of the men in her political life had not understood, or had understood too late. She did not want to be managed. She wanted to be seen. The distinction is more significant than it appears. Every Prime Minister who served under Victoria had to manage the relationship between the Crown and the government, had to navigate the constitutional questions of how much influence a constitutional monarch could legitimately exercise, had to find ways to work with a woman who had strong opinions and was not shy about expressing them. Managing all of this was the job. All of them did it. The difference was in how they did it. William Gladstone, who served as Prime Minister 4 times during Victoria's reign, and was, by most measures, the most significant British statesman of the 19th century, managed it by treating it as a constitutional problem. He was scrupulous, principled, intellectually rigorous, and almost entirely incapable of making Victoria feel that she was anything other than an obstacle to be correctly handled. He explained policy to her in a manner that several observers compared to a man addressing a public meeting rather than a conversation. He was right about many things. He was right about Ireland, about reform, about the direction in which England needed to move. Victoria disagreed with him about most of it, and found his manner of explaining his positions so grating that her letters about him, read today, have a heat in them that is startling from a woman, usually capable of more diplomatic self-expression. She told her household he was a dreadful old man. She told her journal he was impossible. She told her daughter Vicky that he addressed her as though she were a public meeting, which was an observation accurate enough that it has been quoted in every biography written about either of them since. Gladstone was trying to govern. Disraeli was trying to govern and doing one other thing simultaneously, which was paying attention to her, not to the crown, not to the constitutional position, to Victoria. Specifically, the woman who had been a captive child in Kensington and a young queen in love with Melbourne, and the wife of the only man who had ever fully understood her. The woman who had been grieving for over a decade in rooms full of her dead husband's things, and who had somewhere inside the grief and the black and the withdrawal retained the intelligence and the opinions and the political instincts that had always been there, waiting for someone to treat them as worth engaging with. Disraeli engaged with them. He asked her opinion on things he did not need her opinion on. He listened to the answers. He incorporated her views into his thinking, or appeared to do so with enough convincingness that the distinction between appearing and doing became practically irrelevant. He brought her into the narrative of his government as a participant, rather than a figure to be informed and managed. And the effect on Victoria was, by all accounts, considerably. She came back, not all the way, not immediately, and not only because of Disraeli. John Brown had been working at the problem from one direction, getting her body outside and moving, getting her back into the physical world. Disraeli worked at it from another direction, engaging the political mind that the grief had not destroyed but had driven underground. Between them, through the late 1860s and into the 1870s, the widow of Windsor began, gradually and unevenly, to become something else. She became the Empress. The Royal Titles Act of 1876 was Disraeli's initiative. He wanted Victoria to hold the title Empress of India, and he wanted this for reasons that were partly about the prestige of the British position in India, and partly about the pleasure it would give his queen, and he was comfortable with both reasons existing simultaneously. Victoria wanted it. She wanted it with the directness that she brought to the things she wanted when she was not trying to want them discreetly. The title connected her visibly, formally, to the part of the empire that she had been reading about and receiving reports about and discussing with Disraeli for years. The part that felt, in ways she found difficult to fully articulate, but felt genuinely, like the most extraordinary and most complicated inheritance of her reign. She had opinions about India. She expressed them in her correspondence with Disraeli and with her ministers with the directness that he had encouraged and that Gladstone had found exhausting. And Disraeli, characteristically, received these opinions as though they were the most useful input he had received on the matter, which further encouraged their expression. The contrast with Gladstone on the subject of reform and policy was exact and total. Gladstone explained why she was wrong. Disraeli explained how she was right in ways she had not yet fully articulated to herself. The policy results of these two approaches differed significantly, and historians argue about those results with considerable passion. The emotional results were clear. Victoria found the work of government, under Disraeli's ministry, something she could participate in rather than merely authorize. This is the part of Victoria's story that gets lost when the focus stays too long on the grief and the black dress and the Gothic quality of the widow of Windsor. She had strong political opinions. She was capable of sustained engagement with policy questions. She understood the parliamentary system she operated within, its constraints and its possibilities, better than many of the men who formerly ran it. What she needed to bring that capacity to the surface was to be treated as someone who possessed it. Gladstone treated her as a constitutional arrangement. Disraeli treated her as a political mind worth arguing with. She responded to the second approach with a loyalty that lasted past his death. When he died, in April of 1881, Victoria sent primroses to the funeral. She had learned they were his favorite flower. She sent them every year on the anniversary of his death for the rest of her life. The Primrose League, founded in his memory, placed them on his grave each spring for decades after that. She did not send flowers to political funerals as a general practice. The primroses for Disraeli were personal in the way that the lock of Brown's hair was personal, an expression of something that the formal language of Victorian public life had no category for, and that she expressed, therefore, through gesture rather than word. Gladstone outlived Disraeli by 17 years and served as Prime Minister twice more. His relationship with Victoria did not improve. She wrote to her household, in terms that her more careful advisers hoped would never become public, that she considered him dangerous and that she did not trust him, and that she found his visits exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with their length. He was often right. She was often right too, about different things. They were two of the most formidable people in Victorian England, and they found each other nearly impossible. And the historical record of their interactions is one of the more instructive documents of the 19th century, because it shows what happens when a constitutional system puts two brilliant people in the same room and gives them incompatible assumptions about who is supposed to be listening. What the Disraeli years gave Victoria was not primarily a political legacy. Though the political legacy was real, what they gave her was a demonstration that the intelligence she had been developing since the two-layered journals of Kensington, the political instincts that Melbourne had cultivated and Albert had sharpened, and the grief had driven underground, were still there, still usable, still capable of engaging with the world in ways that mattered. She was in her 50s during the Disraeli years. She had 30 more years to live. The 30 years would contain more grief and more absence and more of the particular loneliness of a woman who had outlived almost everyone who had known her young. They would also contain a diamond jubilee that would produce images no one in 1840 could have imagined, a relationship with India that would become the most complicated and revealing chapter of her reign, and a slow accumulation of grandchildren who were quietly assembling themselves into the map of the war that was coming. But in the 1870s, with primroses on the table and Disraeli in the chair across from her, Victoria was present in her own life in ways she had not been for years. She was seen, she was seeing, somewhere in India. A young man named Abdul Karim was growing up in Agra who would, in less than a decade, become the most unexpected and most revealing relationship of her later life. And in the palaces of Europe, her grandchildren were writing letters to each other in the private language of family, not yet knowing what the letters would eventually become evidence of. The machine was running. The future was assembling itself. Victoria was, for the first time in years, paying attention to both. In 1876, Victoria became Empress of India. She never went to India. Set those two sentences next to each other and sit with them, because the distance between them is not a failure or a hypocrisy or even a simple irony. It is the operating principle of empire made visible in the life of one particular woman. Empire runs on distance. It requires people at the center who cannot easily see what is happening at the edges. Victoria did not go to India for the same reason that the men who administered the subcontinent from offices in London did not go, which is that the system was designed to be managed from far away, and going to see it would have complicated the management in ways the system was not built to accommodate. She knew this, in the way that very intelligent people sometimes know things that it would be inconvenient to fully articulate. She received reports about India every week of her reign. She had opinions about the reports. She expressed the opinions to her ministers and to anyone else who raised the subject. And her opinions were sometimes better than the policies that resulted from ignoring them, and sometimes products of the same distance that produced the policies she was criticizing. She never resolved this. What she tried to do instead, in the way that people often address the problems they cannot solve by addressing the problems adjacent to them, was understand India through the people who came to her from it. The person who came to her most consequentially arrived in 1887, the year of her golden Jubilee, as part of a group of Indian servants sent to Windsor. His name was Abdul Karim. He was 24 years old. He came from Agra, where his father was a hospital assistant. He had been selected for the position without being asked whether he wanted it, which was how these decisions were made. And he arrived at Windsor, speaking limited English and knowing essentially nothing about the life he was about to enter. Victoria noticed him almost immediately. She noticed, specifically, that he was intelligent. This was not the observation she was expected to make about an Indian servant in 1887. The expected observations were about his usefulness, his manner, the practical or decorative value he added to the household. Victoria made those observations too, because she was a product of her time in ways she could not entirely see past. But she also noticed the intelligence, and intelligence was the quality she had been responding to her entire life, from Melbourne through Albert through Disraeli, and she responded to it now. She asked him to teach her Hindustani. Picture her at the desk, 68 years old, hands that have held more state papers than any living person in England, a magnifying glass nearby for the documents that have become too small for her aging eyes. And across the desk, a 24-year-old man from Agra, explaining the sounds and rhythms of a language she has been Empress of for 11 years without speaking a word of. The lessons began in the summer of 1887 and continued for the rest of her life. Victoria practiced her vocabulary in her journal. She copied out phrases. She ate curry, which she found she genuinely enjoyed, with an appetite that distinguished her engagement with India from the purely theoretical engagement of most of her ministers. She had Karim explain customs and practices and the texture of daily life in Agra, and she listened in the way that she had always listened best, with the focused attention of someone who understood that most of what was worth knowing could not be found in official reports. She called him her Munshi, the teacher. She promoted him. He became her Indian secretary, a title she created for him, which gave him a formal position in the household and access to the correspondence about India that came across her desk. The household was appalled. The opposition to Karim was not simple. It contained, in roughly equal parts, a legitimate concern that a man without formal administrative training had been given access to sensitive correspondence, the class anxiety of a court that could not process someone who had arrived as a servant being elevated to something approaching a companion, and a racial contempt that expressed itself in the language of propriety and practicality, without acknowledging what it actually was. Victoria found all three objections irritating and said so. She was not entirely wrong to find them irritating. She was also not fully right in dismissing them, because the legitimate concern and the less legitimate contempt were tangled together in ways that made them difficult to separate. And Victoria, who had strong feelings and expressed them strongly, was not always patient enough with the difficulty. She was, in this, as in other things, a product of her position. She had spent her life surrounded by people whose relationship with her was determined by what they could get from her, or what they were paid to do for her. And she had developed, over decades, a heightened sensitivity to the experience of being treated as a person rather than an institution. When someone treated her as a person, she responded with a loyalty that could override other considerations. Karim treated her as a student, as someone whose interest in his world was worth taking seriously, as a woman capable of learning and being changed by what she learned. For Victoria at 68 and 70 and 75, sitting with the Hindustani vocabulary lists and the reports from India and the conversations about Agra, this was a gift whose value she understood precisely because she knew how rarely it was offered. And she did not go to India. She did not go. And the reports continued to arrive, describing conditions that the Hindustani lessons and the curry and the human face of Karim could not fully compensate for in her understanding. Famines that killed millions. Administrative policies whose consequences were measured in lives that the reports converted into numbers before they reached her desk. The structures that turned the resources of a subcontinent into the prosperity of an island thousands of miles away. Structures that had been in place for over a century, and that the title Empress of India had formalized rather than created. The question is not whether Victoria was cruel. She was not cruel. The question is whether affection can exist inside domination. And if it can, what the affection changes and what it leaves unchanged. The affection was real. The dominion was real. Victoria's genuine interest in Karim, her genuine attempt to understand India through him, her genuine grief when she thought about the India she would never see, all of it was real. And none of it changed the fundamental nature of what the relationship between Britain and India was. When Victoria died in January of 1901, Edward VII moved against Karim within hours. His rooms were cleared. His correspondence with Victoria, the letters that ran across 14 years, the letters in which she had written about Hindustani and India, and what she was learning and what she was thinking, was confiscated and burned, not filed, not sealed for future historians. Burned. Edward ordered it, and it was done. And the 14 years of correspondence between the Empress of India and the man who had tried to make India comprehensible to her at a human scale was converted to ash before the royal funeral had concluded. Karim was sent back to India. He had a house in Agra that Victoria had given him. He had a pension. He lived in Agra until 1909, when he died, and he was buried there. And the story of what he and Victoria were to each other is still being reconstructed from the fragments that survived the fire. What was in those letters that a new king decided, on the day of his mother's funeral, could not be allowed to exist? We do not know. We cannot know. That is the answer Edward's order was designed to produce. The letters are gone, and the answer is gone with them. And what remains is the fact of the burning, which tells you something about what was feared, even if it cannot tell you what was actually there. Victoria had tried to know India through one person. She had tried to close, through individual relationship, the distance that the system she embodied required to function. She had not closed it. She had not been able to close it. But she had tried, genuinely tried, writing Hindustani vocabulary in a journal at 68 years old. And the evidence of that trying was burned by her son before she was in the ground. The empire she had been empress of for 25 years outlasted her by 46 years. India waited considerably longer than that. On the morning of June 22nd, 1897, a soldier from Jamaica put on his uniform and took his place in a procession that stretched for miles through the streets of London. He was not thinking about empire as an abstract concept. He was thinking about the uniform, which was hot, and the crowd, which was enormous, and the distance between where he was standing and the place he had come from, which was not a distance that could be measured in miles alone. He had crossed an ocean to stand in this street. He had done it in service of something that the people organizing this procession called the British Empire. And the British Empire had sent him here to be visible, to be part of the image being assembled on this day for the eyes of London, and through London for the eyes of the world. He was a piece of the argument. The argument was this: look at what we have built. Look at how far it extends. Look at the people who come from every corner of it to stand in this street and honor this queen. The empire is not a system of extraction. It is a family. And here is the family, assembled on a June morning in London, dressed and ready to be seen. This is what the Diamond Jubilee was. It was an argument made in images rather than words, which is the most powerful kind of argument, because images do not announce themselves as arguments. They present themselves as simply what is there, what happened, what was seen. The argument inside the image is invisible because it has been built into the composition, into who is included and where they stand and what they are wearing and what the camera is pointed at and what it is pointed away from. More than 50,000 troops from across the empire were assembled for the Jubilee procession. They came from Canada and Australia and India and South Africa and the Caribbean, and dozens of territories whose names most people in London could not have located on a map. They marched through streets lined with millions of people, and they were extraordinary to see. And the extraordinariness was the argument. This is what 60 years of Victoria's reign had produced. This, all of this. The Queen who made it possible was 78 years old and suffering from cataracts and rheumatism and the accumulated physical damage of a body that had been carrying more than its share for decades. She could not walk the procession route. She rode in an open carriage, small and still and dressed in black as she had been dressed for 36 years. And the crowd that lined the streets roared as the carriage passed, in a way that observers described as unlike anything they had heard before. She did not wave in the manner of modern royalty. The practiced gesture designed to be replicated in photographs from multiple angles. She nodded. She inclined her head. She received the noise of 6 miles of crowd with the stillness of someone who had been absorbing public attention for 60 years and had learned, somewhere in that time, the difference between performing response and simply being present to it. At one point the carriage passed through a particularly dense section of crowd, and the noise was, by multiple accounts, overwhelming. Victoria bowed her head. A lady in waiting, leaning close enough to hear her, said that the Queen whispered, almost to herself, "How kind. How very kind. Not how magnificent, not how powerful, not how right and proper that they should come out to honor 60 years of reign. How kind." The girl from Kensington, after everything, was still surprised that people wanted to see her. The procession included the premier and representatives from every self-governing colony. It included Indian cavalry who had traveled across continents. It included soldiers from territories whose participation in the British Empire had been decided by administrators rather than by the people being administered. It included people who were there as evidence of British reach and British civilization, in a vocabulary of civilization that had been defined entirely by the people doing the including. Stand in the crowd for a moment and look at the carriage from where those people stood. The soldier from Jamaica, in his hot uniform on the June morning, what did he see when the small woman in black went past? The woman from Bombay, standing 3 rows back in the crowd, what did she see? The man from County Cork, who had come to London 20 years ago and never gone back, what did he see? The answers are not the same answer. They cannot be the same answer. And the image that went out into the world, through the newspapers and the photographs and the reports of the day, contained all of them and distinguished between none of them. It showed the procession. The procession was magnificent. what it was magnificent for, what it was evidence of, what it required to produce and sustain. These questions were outside the frame. Victoria sat at a state banquet that evening with foreign princes and dignitaries from across the world, and watched the toasts, and received the congratulations, and was, by all accounts, visibly moved. She wrote in her journal that it had been the most wonderful day of her life. She had written those words before, about the wedding morning and about certain moments with Albert, and about a handful of other days across the 60 years that had preceded this one. She meant them each time. She meant them now. She was 78 years old. She had been queen for 60 years. She had buried her husband and several of her children, and most of the people who had known her when she was young. She had watched the world change more in her lifetime than it had changed in the previous 500 years. And she had changed with it, not always gracefully, not always at the right pace, not always in the right directions, but genuinely, in ways that the young woman who had refused to walk alone down the stairs at Kensington could not have predicted. What she did not know, sitting in the banquet hall with the toasts still being raised, was that the image of the day would outlive her by longer than she could have imagined. The diamond Jubilee photograph of the small woman in the open carriage would become one of the defining images of the 19th century. It would appear in history books and documentaries and classrooms for as long as people tried to understand what that century had been and what it had cost, and who had paid that cost, and who had received the benefit. She thought, that evening, that the day was an ending, a celebration of what had been built over 60 years. It was not an ending. It was the last clear image of a world that was about to change more rapidly than anyone in the banquet hall understood. The grandchildren writing letters to each other in English across the courts of Europe were already a decade closer to the moment when those letters would stop. The empires sending their finest soldiers to march through London were a generation away from the wars that would end them. The order that the Jubilee celebrated, the arrangement of power and territory and trade that had made Britain the centre of a global system, was closer to its end than to its beginning. But on the evening of June 22nd, 1897, with the crowd still thinning in the streets outside and the banquet still in progress inside, none of that was visible. The image machine had produced its greatest image. The argument had been made. The empire had celebrated itself. In London, with the small woman in black at the centre of it, and it had looked magnificent, and the magnificence was real, and what lay behind it was also real, and both things were true at the same time. How kind, Victoria had whispered in the carriage, how very kind. Victoria had 63 grandchildren. She knew most of their names, which is more than can be said for most grandparents of 63. And she knew more than their names. She knew their temperaments and their marriages and their politics and their health and the ways in which each of them did or did not resemble the people she had loved. She wrote to them. She received them at Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne. She sent them gifts and advice and the particular kind of royal grandmother correspondence that mixed genuine affection with a directness about their failings that they found alternately warming and alarming, depending on the day. She called the whole enterprise her family, and she meant it. And she also meant something larger by it, because the family she had built across 37 years of careful dynastic arrangement stretched from Britain to Germany to Russia to Spain to Romania to Greece to Norway to Sweden. And it was, in her understanding, something more than a family. It was a web, a network of relationship and shared blood that would, she believed, make war between its nodes less likely in ways that mere diplomacy could not achieve, because diplomacy could be abandoned. But family, Real family, with history and memory and Christmas visits and shared childhood embarrassments, was different. She was not wrong about the theory. The theory had worked. Imperfectly. For centuries in the world where it had been developed. The problem was that the world had changed in ways that the theory had not caught up with. Focus on three names: Wilhelm, Frederick Wilhelm Victor Albrecht of Hohenzollern, German Emperor and King of Prussia, the eldest son of Victoria's eldest daughter Vicky. He was born in 1859, the first grandchild, the one whose arrival Victoria had celebrated with the particular intensity that first grandchildren generate. His birth had been complicated, a difficult delivery that left his left arm permanently damaged and shorter than his right, and Victoria had followed his early years with the concern of a grandmother who understood, better than most, what it was to grow up with something to compensate for. She called him Willie in her letters. He called her Grandmama Queen, Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, Tsar of all the Russias, who had married Alex of Hesse, a granddaughter of Victoria through her daughter Alice. Alex had spent enough time at Windsor as a child that Victoria knew her well, had concerns about the match, had expressed the concerns, and had been unable to prevent it because Alex loved Nicholas, and Nicholas loved Alex and love, as Victoria, of all people, understood, had a way of making the concerns of grandmothers feel like obstacles rather than wisdom. She called him Nicky in the letters that passed between the family. He called her Grandmama. George Frederick Ernest Albert, the second son of Bertie, Prince of Wales, who became heir to the British throne after his older brother died young. George was the grandchild who was most visibly like his grandmother in temperament, dutiful and emotionally contained, and possessed of a sense of obligation to his role that expressed itself in steadiness rather than brilliance. Victoria approved of him with the warmth she reserved for people who reminded her of the best version of herself. She called him Georgie. He called her Grandmama. Willie and Nicky and Georgie, they had played together as children in the grounds of English country houses, when the geography of their scattered thrones brought them together for holidays and weddings and the funerals that punctuate the lives of large families. They had written to each other in English, because English was the language they shared, the language of the grandmother at the center of the web. The letters are warm. They are family letters, with the shorthand and the private references and the accumulated texture of people who have known each other since before they were the people their official positions required them to be. In August of 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Willie declared war on Nicky. The letters in English, the shared childhood, the grandmother who had signed her correspondence to both of them with the same hand, none of it functioned as a break. Germany declared war on France. Britain declared war on Germany. Georgie was now at war with Willie. The family map had become a war map, the standard explanation for how cousins who wrote warm letters to each other managed to send armies of millions against each other's countries is that the personal relationships between monarchs did not control the structural forces that produced the war. The nationalism, the military planning, the arms races, the alliance systems, the accumulated tensions of 40 years of industrial competition. These were larger than any letter written in English between cousins who shared a grandmother. When the crisis came, the structural forces moved faster than the personal ones could respond. This explanation is correct as far as it goes. It does not account for the particular quality of what happened, which is that the warmth of the letters makes the declarations of war not more comprehensible, but more terrible. These were not strangers who found themselves at war. They were people who had nicknames for each other, who had sat at the same table at family gatherings, who had a grandmother whose death they had all been present for, or close to, 13 years before the guns began. Victoria had believed that family would hold. She had built the family on that belief, had arranged marriages across a generation, had written letters across a continent, had used her position at the center of the web to pull threads of relationship between courts that might otherwise have had no human connection at all. Like many royal families of her era, she believed that shared blood and shared history could bind the ambitions of nations together. She was not wrong about the past. She could not see the future. The future was not the kind of thing that the 19th century had taught its inhabitants to see, because the future it was about to produce was unlike anything that had come before it, and the tools for imagining it had not yet been made. Wilhelm lost his throne in 1918. When Germany surrendered and the German Republic was proclaimed without asking his permission, he went into exile in the Netherlands, where he lived until 1941. Nicholas lost his throne in 1917, when the Russian Revolution removed him, and was shot with his wife and all 5 of his children in a basement in Yekaterinburg in July of 1918. Alexei, Nicholas's son, the boy with the blood condition that had travelled to him through the gene that had passed from Victoria through Alice to Alex, died in the same basement. 17 years old, George kept his throne. He kept it partly by not being in a losing country, and partly by following advice offered to him in 1917, when the German surname of the royal family had become a political liability in wartime Britain. To change that name, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the name Albert had carried from Coburg to England, and that his descendants had carried for 3 generations, was replaced by the House of Windsor, named after the castle, named after the town, named after nothing German at all. Albert's name was quietly set aside, replaced by something more reassuringly local. Victoria had tried to make family hold against the forces of the century. She had not failed because the attempt was foolish. She had failed because the century changed the forces, made nationalism and industrial military power into things that family connection could not contain, and she had not lived long enough to see it. She died in 1901, with the web intact, the grandchildren writing their letters, Willie and Nicky and Georgie still family. The war was still invisible in the future. Perhaps that was a mercy too. She built the family. The century used the family for something she had not built it for. Neither outcome was written in advance. And the warmth of the letters was real. And the war was real. And both things are true. And the distance between them is the distance that the 19th century left for the 20th to cross. In the last years of Victoria's life, she used a magnifying glass to read the state papers. Her eyesight had been failing for years, the cataracts advancing with the slow, irreversible patience of age. And by the late 1890s, she could not read ordinary print without assistance. So she used the magnifying glass. The red boxes arrived at her desk as they had arrived every day for 60 years. And she opened them and removed the papers and held the glass over the lines of type and read them. Slowly, with the concentration of someone who understands that slowing down does not mean stopping. No one who worked for her in those years described a woman who had given up. What they described was a woman who had gotten old, which is a different thing, and who was managing the difference with the same combination of will and duty that had managed every other difficult thing in her life. Her body had become a problem to be solved. She solved it with the magnifying glass and the wheelchair, and the reading stand that allowed her to work when sitting upright was too painful, and the staff who had learned, over years of service, exactly how to be useful without being intrusive. She weighed less than 100 pounds. She had to be helped in and out of carriages. Her hearing was not what it had been, and she was the Queen Empress of the most powerful empire in the world. And she intended to continue being that until she could not. The Boer War arrived in 1899, and it was still being fought when she died. It was the war in South Africa between the British Empire and the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, fought over the rights of British settlers in Boer territory, and over the gold and diamonds that lay beneath South African soil, and the question of who would control them. Victoria did not become an anti-imperialist in the last years of her life. She did not write letters questioning whether the war was just or whether the empire was a moral enterprise. She was not capable of that reversal, and honesty requires saying so. Rather than granting her a deathbed conversion, she did not have. What she did was go to the hospitals. She visited the military hospitals where the wounded from South Africa were being treated, and she moved through the wards in her wheelchair, and she spoke to the men in the beds, and she learned their names when they told her their names, and she asked where they had been wounded and how they were recovering and whether their families had been notified. She wrote letters to the families of men who had died, not form letters sent by a secretary, letters in her own hand, or dictated in her own words when her hand could no longer manage the volume. Specific to the man, specific to the loss. The Boer War did not turn Victoria into a critic of empire, but it forced the old Empress to face the human cost of the empire in hospital beds and casualty lists in a way that reports and summaries had always made easier to abstract. There is a difference between believing in something and being comfortable with its price. In those last years, Victoria was no longer entirely comfortable. She wrote fewer letters in the last years, because writing had become physically difficult. But she wrote enough that the emotional texture of the period is recoverable. She was tired. She said so. She was tired in the way of someone who has been working for 60 years and whose body has finally begun making an argument that the work has to end. She was also, intermittently, at peace with things that had troubled her for a long time. Not because the trouble had resolved, but because some troubles become smaller when the horizon closes. Albert. She thought about Albert constantly, or rather she had never stopped thinking about him. But in the last years, the thinking changed quality. The acute grief of the 1860s and the structured grief of the decades after, the maintained rooms and the ritual hot water and the careful preservation of everything he had touched, had softened over 40 years into something that was not grief exactly anymore. Or not only grief, it was more like conversation. She had spent 40 years talking to him in her head, and in the last years she was still talking, and the talking had become as natural as breathing. The ongoing interior exchange of someone who has decided that the people you love do not stop being available simply because they stop being present. She still slept with the cast of his hand. She still wore black. She still had his clothes laid out, though in the last years the practice had become more obviously ritual than it had been when the grief was new. A ceremony maintained, because ceremonies create continuity, and continuity was one of the things she had always understood as her primary responsibility to the people she served. The world she had known was disappearing. Melbourne was gone. Albert was gone. Disraeli was gone. Brown was gone. Most of the politicians and statesmen she had worked with across 6 decades were gone, replaced by a new generation of men who knew her only as a very old woman in black. a historical monument still somehow in motion, rather than as the young queen who had walked into the Privy Council in 1837 and spoken her declaration in a voice that did not shake. She knew this. She was not vain about her place in the living present. She had spent too long thinking about history, reading it and living inside it, to confuse being historically significant with being currently relevant in the ways that matter most to the people around you every day. What she had left, and what she exercised, with the magnifying glass and the wheelchair and the continuing daily opening of the red boxes, was duty, the word Melbourne had given her on the first morning, the word she had taken into herself as the organizing principle of everything that followed. It had outlasted love, and outlasted grief, and outlasted health, and outlasted the people who had taught it to her. And it was what remained when everything else had been stripped away. There is a particular quality to the endurance of very old people who have decided they are not finished yet. It does not look like strength in the conventional sense, because the conventional sense of strength involves physical capacity and forward momentum and the appearance of ease. This endurance looks like its opposite: slow, labored, assisted at every step by people and devices and arrangements made to compensate for what the body can no longer do on its own. But underneath the slowness is something that has very little to do with the body, which is the decision made every morning to continue. Victoria made that decision every morning of the last years. She made it with a magnifying glass and a wheelchair and staff who knew how to be useful without being intrusive. And she made it the way she had made every important decision since the sick room at Kensington, which was without asking anyone's permission and without advertising that a decision had been made. Some freedoms are too large for sentences. Some decisions are too fundamental to announce. She went to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight in November of 1900. She had been there in every winter of her reign, or nearly every winter. It was the house Albert had designed, the house that was more entirely theirs than any other place they had lived. And she went there as she always went there, with the intention of resting and the knowledge that resting was not entirely in her nature. She was not well. She had not been well for some time. The household knew it. The doctors knew it. Her children and the grandchildren, who were near enough to visit, knew it. And Victoria knew it with the clarity of someone who has been alive long enough to recognize the difference between ordinary aging and the particular closing that comes before the end. She read the state papers with the magnifying glass. She wrote in her journal. She looked out the windows at the Solent, the stretch of water between the island and the mainland. The water that Albert had looked at from the same windows when he was designing the house and had loved for its calm and its light. She did not finish her last journal entry. It stops mid-sentence. In a hand that is shakier than the hands of the earlier entries, but still unmistakably hers. Still carrying in its uneven lines the pressure of a personality that had been putting itself into words since the age of 13. She stopped writing on January 22nd, 1901, her last fully coherent word, spoken to her doctor, was recorded as Bertie, the name she had used for her son Edward for his entire life. She was calling for him. He came. Wilhelm came. The household gathered. The grandchildren, who could get there in time, got there. And in the bedroom at Osborne House, on a January evening with the Solent quiet outside the windows, the woman who had been queen since June of 1837 drew her last breath. She was 81 years old. She had been queen for 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days. The red box that arrived at Osborne the following morning was the first in 63 years that did not need to be opened. They had been preparing for this for years without saying so. Every household has its way of not saying the things that are too large to say directly. And the household of an 81-year-old queen, who had been visibly declining for the better part of a decade, had developed an extensive vocabulary of not saying. The doctor's reports that recorded concerns in language calibrated to inform without alarming. The household staff, who had quietly begun maintaining certain protocols with an extra layer of care. The children and grandchildren, who arrived at Osborne in the first weeks of January, with explanations for their visits that did not quite explain why all of them had chosen this particular moment. Victoria knew. She had been a reader of rooms her entire life. From the supervised rooms of Kensington, where she had learned to pass the difference between what was being said and what was being meant. Through the political rooms where Melbourne and Disraeli had taught her that the gap between those two things was where power actually lived. To the rooms of her own household, where she had spent 60 years watching people navigate the distance between their interests and her preferences. She knew what the gathering meant. She received the arriving family with a completeness of attention that the people on the receiving end of it found later, in the letters they wrote to each other, impossible to describe without sounding like they were describing something they did not quite believe had happened. She was present to them in the last days, in a way that was different from ordinary presence, as though she had decided, in the last resources of the energy that the magnifying glass and the red boxes and the 60 years of duty had finally depleted, to spend what remained of it on looking. She looked at her children and her grandchildren with the concentrated attention of someone making a record, filing it somewhere that was not the journal, which she could no longer write in with any consistency, but somewhere. The interior archive of a woman who had been keeping records since the age of 13 and who understood, even now, that the record mattered. Edward was there. He had arrived in the first days of January and had not left. Managing the obligations of his position as Prince of Wales, the position he had occupied for 59 years, with the part of himself that had always been very good at managing obligations, while the other part of him sat with his mother and waited. The relationship between them had never been simple. Victoria had spent decades in a complicated dance with Bertie that mixed genuine love with genuine frustration. The frustration of a mother who could see in her son both the qualities she valued most and the qualities that worried her most, and who had never quite found the language that could hold both observations simultaneously without losing one of them. In the last days at Osborne, the complications simplified what was left. When the energy for complication was gone, was the love, which had always been there underneath, and which surfaced now with the directness that approaching endings tend to produce in people who have spent their lives being indirect about important things. She held his hand. Wilhelm arrived from Germany, travelling with the speed of a man who understands that there is a deadline and that missing it cannot be undone. He was 42 years old, the same age Albert had been when he died. A coincidence that no one mentioned and that hung in the air of Osborne anyway. Present and unspoken. He was the Kaiser of Germany and the grandson of the dying woman, and he was, in the private interior of whatever he actually was, beneath the public performance of being the Kaiser. Frightened, he took her in his arms and he held her. And he held her. And the people in the room, who recorded what they saw, described a man who was not performing grief. He was a grandson. The woman in his arms was his grandmother. The distance between the years collapsed the way distances collapse at the end, when what matters is not the space between lives, but the specific weight of the person and the specific history of having known them. He held her for 2.5 hours. In 13 years, He would help lead Germany into the war that broke royal Europe apart forever. In 13 years, the warm letters in English between Willie and Nicky and Georgie would be artifacts of a world that had ended, evidence of a family connection that had proven insufficient to the forces arranged against it. In 13 years, the people standing in this room, or their children, or the empires they represented, would be at war with each other. But on January 22nd, 1901, at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, he was holding his grandmother, and the grief was real, and the 13 years had not happened yet, and both things, the grief and the future, were equally present, and no one in the room could see both of them at once. This is the thing about being inside a historical moment. You can see what is in the room. You cannot see what the room is standing next to. She died at 6:30 in the evening. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when they have been full of the effort of waiting and the waiting has ended. The household moved through the next hours with the efficiency of people who had been, in their careful, unspoken way, preparing. The doctors confirmed what was already known. The notifications were drafted and sent. The protocols that govern the death of a monarch, protocols that had been maintained and updated throughout her reign for exactly this eventuality, began to operate. Edward was king. He had been king. Technically, since 6:30 in the evening. He would be formally proclaimed the following day. Before the household moved to the tasks that the night required, Victoria's instructions for what would be placed with her were carried out by the members of her household she had specifically named for the purpose. The dressing gown Albert had worn in the last weeks of his life, preserved for 40 years with the same careful attention that had preserved the hot water and the laid-out clothes and the cast of his hand. It was placed beside her, the plaster cast of Albert's hand, the one she had taken to bed every night for 40 years, the one whose shape she knew better than she knew her own hands by the end. It was placed with her, a lock of Albert's hair, preserved in a locket that had been opened and closed so many times, the hinge had been replaced twice, and then, by the hands of the household members she had specifically named for this particular task, a lock of John Brown's hair, wrapped in tissue paper, placed in her left hand, concealed beneath the flowers that would be visible when the coffin was inspected. Edward would not see it. Edward would not know. The instructions had been given with full awareness of this, with the quiet determination of a woman who had learned from the Kensington system onward how to accomplish things through careful arrangement rather than direct confrontation. The hair went into the coffin. Nobody told Edward. And finally, brought from its storage by the household member designated for the purpose, wrapped in the tissue paper that had wrapped it for 61 years. The white dress from the morning of February 10th, 1840. The dress was placed with her 61 years. The dress that had helped turn a bridal colour into the dream of a generation sat in its wrappings and had waited. Through everything this story has described, for this moment, Victoria had released the image of it into the world, and the world had taken it and made it something larger than any individual, woman's choice on any individual morning. The tradition had escaped its origin decades ago. It belonged to everyone now. It belonged to the idea of a wedding rather than to any particular wedding. What she kept, in the end, was the dress itself, not the tradition, which was already everywhere. The original, the thing that had existed before it became a symbol, when it was still just a choice made by a 20-year-old woman who wanted to show off some lace and discovered, too late to take it back, that the world had been watching. The coffin was closed outside Osborne House. The news moved outward in the way that news moves. When the telegraph has been invented, and the world is connected by wires, under oceans, and through the hearts of continents, it moved to London, and from London to every corner of the empire, in India, where it was morning already. People woke up to a world in which the woman who had been Empress of India was no longer alive. In Canada and Australia and the Caribbean and Africa, the news arrived in various languages and was received in various ways that were not all the same way, because the empire was not one thing experienced by one kind of person. In London, the flags went to half-mast, and the newspapers produced their special editions, and the people who had known Victoria only as a permanent and apparently inexhaustible feature of the landscape experienced the peculiar disorientation of having a fixed point removed from their sky. She had been queen for 63 years. There were people in England who had been born, lived full lives, and died without ever living under a different monarch. 3 generations for whom Victoria was not history, but simply the queen, the way the sun is simply the sun. Now she was gone. The funeral was arranged for February 2nd. The coffin travelled from Osborne to the mainland on a royal yacht called Alberta, crossing the Solent in the cold February light, escorted by warships on both sides. The gun salute that marked her passage across the water was fired by ships of the Navy that Albert had helped to build and that Victoria had presided over for 60 years. The sound of it carried across the water and was heard on the shore by people who had come to watch and who stood in the cold without speaking while the yacht moved past. She went to Windsor. She was buried at Frogmore, in the mausoleum that she and Albert had built together 40 years earlier, where Albert had been waiting for her since December of 1861. The mausoleum was closed. The white dress was in the ground. The empire that had assembled itself in the name of the woman who lay inside continued to operate, because empires do not pause for funerals. And the red boxes that had not needed to be opened on the morning of January 23rd continued to arrive at the desks of the people who would now open them. And the work continued, and the image machine kept running, and the image that had been built over 63 years continued to do what images do once they are released into the world. They continue without the person who made them. A bride puts on a white dress. She does not know why white is the color of a wedding dress. She does not know the name of the woman who helped make it the color of a wedding dress. She knows only that white is what wedding dresses are. The way she knows that Christmas trees have lights and that families take photographs together. The way she knows 100 other things that feel like they have always been true because she has never lived in a world where they were not true. She puts on the dress and looks in the mirror and sees exactly what she is supposed to see. And the reflection is one of the most reproduced images in human culture. The woman in the white dress. And behind the image, invisible, untraceable, except through a very long chain of historical consequence, is the morning of February 10th, 1840, when a 20-year-old in London decided that the lace-makers of Devon deserved better and chose white because white showed the Honiton lace to its best advantage. The decision left the room where it was made before the wedding was over. It moved into the newspapers and the illustrated magazines and the print shop windows, and from there into the understanding of a generation of women who saw the image and filed it somewhere that was not quite conscious, somewhere that would surface later when the occasion arose. And then those women had daughters, and the daughters did the same, and the daughters had daughters, and 200 years of weddings later, the woman in the mirror, in the white dress, does not know where the white came from. This is what it means for an image to outlive its origin. Consider the other images that Victoria and Albert released into the world. The Christmas tree, brought into the Windsor sitting room each December, photographed for the illustrated newspapers, reproduced across England, and from England, across the English-speaking world, until the Christmas tree was simply what Christmas looked like. Not a tradition popularized by a royal household, but a universal fact of December that everyone had always done. The family photograph, everyone looking at the camera. The composition that says, "We are here and we are together, and we want you to know it." The grammar of domestic visibility that Albert had understood and Victoria had inhabited. And that became the grammar of every family photograph taken in every living room and garden and school graduation and birthday party in the world that learned to take photographs. The royal funeral, public and ceremonial, and watched by the many. The idea that the death of a head of state was a collective event rather than a private one. That the grief of a nation had a form, and the form involved processions and gun salutes and streets lined with people who had come to bear witness to something larger than their own individual lives. All of these came from the house that Victoria and Albert built in the 1840s and 1850s. From the image machine that Albert designed and Victoria inhabited, and that kept running after Albert died because he had built it to run without him, and because Victoria had understood what she was inhabiting well enough to keep, inhabiting it through 40 years of grief and absence and return. But the images did not only carry the gentle things, the image of the royal family as a model of domestic virtue, warm and decent and organized around the values of the middle-class home, had been built in the same years and using the same methods as the empire that those values were deployed to justify. The family portrait and the famine ship existed in the same decade and the same world, and the image machine had shown one of them and not the other, and the one it had shown was the one that made, the one it had not shown easier not to see. The grandmother at the center of the family web and the grandmother at the center of the war map were the same woman. The kindness that expressed itself in the hospital visits and the letters to bereaved families and the whispered how kind, how very kind, in the carriage at the Jubilee, and the distance that expressed itself in never going to India and in the burning of the letters that might have made India too visible to manage comfortably. These were also the same woman. She was not a villain. She was not a saint. She was a person of considerable intelligence and considerable limitation, who lived inside the systems of her time so completely that she could not see them as systems. She could not see them as anything other than the conditions of existence. The way the sun is simply the sun. The systems outlasted her. Some of them are still outlasting us. 13 years after Osborne House, the grandchildren went to war. Wilhelm lost his throne in 1918. Nicholas was shot in 1918 with his wife and children in a basement in Yekaterinburg. George kept his throne and changed his family's name from the German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the English Windsor. Which was the castle? Which was the town? Which was nothing German at all? Albert's name was quietly set aside, replaced by the name of a building. The empire that had paraded through London at the Diamond Jubilee survived Victoria by 46 years. India achieved independence in 1947. The other territories followed, through paths that varied from the relatively peaceful to the catastrophically violent. Over the decades that followed, the flags came down, the maps were redrawn, the administrators went home. What remained, after the empire was gone, was stranger and more durable than the empire had been. The English language, spoken now by more people as a second language than as a first. The legal and administrative frameworks, retained in modified forms by the countries that had been administered through them, the trade relationships, the educational systems, the railways, the parliamentary procedures, the cricket, the things that empire leaves behind when it goes, that cannot be packed up and taken home because they have already become part of the places they were introduced to, and the images, the bride in the white dress, the family around the Christmas tree, the royal family on the balcony, visible, present to the public that has turned out to see them, maintaining the contract that Albert built and Victoria inhabited and that the monarchy has been trying to maintain ever since. The contract that says we will be seen, and in exchange for being seen, you will accept us. And in exchange for accepting us, we will give you something to look at that is human enough to love and elevated enough to admire. And we will do this for as long as the arrangement holds. Victoria's great-great-granddaughter sat on the same throne for 70 years. Her son sits on it now. The family whose image was invented in the 1840s is still being photographed, still being watched, still producing images that travel through the world, doing things their makers did not quite intend. The white dress is still in the ground at Frogmore, with the plaster cast and the locks of hair and the tissue paper and 61 years of keeping. The tradition it helped start is still traveling, still moving through generations of women who see the dress in the mirror and see exactly what they are supposed to see and do not see, cannot see. The morning in 1840, and the lace-makers of Devon, and the girl who had never been allowed to walk down the stairs alone, and who chose this one thing, this one completely personal and completely public thing, with the full force of herself. She was buried in February. The empire she had been Empress of outlasted her by nearly 5 decades. The images she had released into the world outlasted the empire. Victoria did not make the modern world alone, but she helped teach it how power could look like family, how grief could look like dignity, and how an image, once released into the world, belongs to everyone, except the person who first wore it. The white dress is still traveling. It has not arrived yet.